What if a single compromise in 1820 decided whether millions would live in freedom or in chains? What if a line drawn on a map determined the destiny of a nation still young and fragile? On this day, 2 centuries ago, the United States balanced on the knife edge of expansion and disunion, and history chose a path that still shapes us today. Year 1820, Washington City, the fledgling capital of the American Republic. In the tall halls of Congress, smoke from whale oil lamps drifted against vaulted ceilings. Men in cravats and frock coats debated with voices sharp as sabers, each sentence weighed against the survival of the Union. In the galleries above, anxious citizens leaned forward, straining to hear. On the streets outside, free, black families, merchants, and enslaved men serving as carriage drivers sensed that whatever the outcome inside those chambers, it would ripple into their lives for generations. Hello, everyone. Tonight I'll take you back to a moment in history, the early 19th century. A restless republic stretched from the Atlantic coast through the Appalachian frontier, eyeing the Mississippi Valley and dreaming of the Pacific. Their names were Henry Clay, the Great Compromiser, and an entire generation of lawmakers, bound in a struggle not just of policy, but of conscience. They lived in a world where every new state, free or slave, meant a shift in power that could determine the fate of millions. And that world was about to change forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, hit like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where are you listening from and what time is it there. It's incredible to see people around the world sharing this same moment together. In just a few seconds, your screen will begin to dim. That's not a glitch. It's designed to protect your eyes from blue light. Science shows blue light suppresses melatonin, the hormone that helps you rest. When your screen dims, your brain will understand it's time to unwind. So, turn off the lights. Put your headphones on. Let's begin. The story opens in 1819. 11 free states, 11 slave states. The Senate, that delicate seesaw of representation, balanced evenly. Into this tense equilibrium stepped Missouri, applying for statehood with slavery enshrined in its constitution. For Southerners, it was a natural right settlers had carried enslaved labor across the Mississippi. For Northerners, it was an alarming encroachment of bondage into the Louisiana Purchase lands. The proposal cracked open an argument that had simmered since the nation's birth. Could slavery expand, or must it be contained? New England's congressmen thundered that the founders had envisioned liberty, not chains. Southern firebrands countered that property rights, including in human beings, were sacred under the Constitution. For months the debate raged, pamphlets flew off, presses, pulpits, thundered, taverns buzzed. The fragile Union looked ready to break, not over foreign threats, but from within. Then Henry Clay of Kentucky, skilled in brokering deals, stepped forward. He offered compromise, admit Missouri as a slave state, but balance it with Maine carved free from Massachusetts. Beyond that, draw a line across the Louisiana Territory, at latitude 36°30. North of it slavery banned, south of it permitted. It was a crude solution, a geographical bandage, applied to a moral wound. The vote was narrow, the relief immense. Celebrations erupted, the Union for now preserved. Newspapers hailed Clay as savior. Yet beneath the jubilation, shadows stretched. By codifying the expansion of slavery in one half of the continent, while restricting it in another, the compromise did not resolve the question. It only postponed the reckoning. Men like Thomas Jefferson, retired at Monticello, warned privately that this firebell in the night signaled a crisis that could consume the Republic. And so Part 1 closes with the uneasy truth: the Missouri Compromise bought time but not peace. The Union breathed, but every breath carried the scent of powder and the forewarning of war. Next time, we will follow the restless push westward, Manifest Destiny, Texas, and the fever that expansion unleashed. For now, the question remains, how long can a republic balance freedom and slavery on the edge of a map? The Missouri Compromise had quieted the storm, but only for a season. The 1,822nd and 1,832nd opened onto a landscape of opportunity and anxiety. The American Republic, still less than 50 years old, was bursting with confidence. Rivers carried steamboats into the frontier canals, stitched the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, and new rail lines whispered of a future where distance would vanish. The air crackled with ambition. Farmers in Ohio dreamed of rich prairies farther west. Merchants in New York and Boston spoke of ships bound for Pacific harbors. Politicians in Washington repeated a phrase that would define an age: manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was not merely policy. It was faith wrapped in nationalism. Americans believed they were destined, even divinely appointed, to span the continent. Newspapers proclaimed that the sun of civilization must set on the Pacific. But every mile of expansion carried the old question: would the soil be worked by free labor or by the hands of the enslaved? Each new territory threatened to tilt the delicate balance struck in 1820. Take Texas. Once a Mexican province, it drew restless settlers from the south, eager for cotton land. Many brought enslaved laborers in defiance of Mexican law. By the 1,832nd, Texas boiled with tension between the Mexican government and Anglo-American colonists. The Texas Revolution in 1836 birthed a new republic, independent and precarious, ruled by men who envisioned it as a slave-holding bastion. From the first days of its independence, Texas petitioned to join the United States. For Southerners, annexation promised vast new slave territory. For Northerners, it threatened disruption of the balance and expansion of an institution many despised. President Andrew Jackson, and later Martin Van Buren, hesitated. Annexation risked war with Mexico and turmoil at home, but the idea never faded. Texas hovered like a phantom over every debate, its admission inevitable, but the timing uncertain. In taverns from Boston to New Orleans, men argued whether Texas meant prosperity or doom. The longer the question lingered, the more combustible it became. Meanwhile, the nation flexed its muscle elsewhere. In 1836, Arkansas entered as a slave state, balanced by Michigan as a free state. In 1837, the seesaw continued, but each admission felt more fraught. In 1845, with the annexation of Texas finally achieved, the nation took a step that could not be undone. Mexico fumed, relations snapped, and war loomed. Manifest destiny had carried the Republic into new lands, but it also carried it closer to confrontation. Beneath the political debates lay human stories. Enslaved families in the Deep South feared that every new cotton frontier meant harsher conditions and more broken ties. Free black communities in the North, though small, watched anxiously as the horizon of slavery stretched westward. Immigrants arriving from Ireland and Germany faced a society already riven with sectional tension, where opportunity and prejudice marched hand in hand. The expanding frontier promised riches for some, ruin for others. In the halls of Congress, tempers rose. John Quincy Adams, by then serving in the House after his presidency, fought tirelessly against the gag rule that barred debate on slavery petitions. Southerners viewed him as a meddler. Northerners hailed him as a moral voice. In his aging figure, Americans saw a glimpse of the future struggle, one man defying silence, demanding that the Republic confront its contradiction. By the mid-1842nd, the United States was a nation transformed. Its population doubled, its borders stretched wider, and its ambition burned brighter. Yet the compromise line of 1,820 looked increasingly fragile. The map of America swelled, but the line drawn across it threatened to snap under the pressure of manifest destiny. The compromise had been a truce, not a solution. Expansion was no longer an idea, it was reality, and reality once set in motion demanded reckoning. As we leave this chapter, the question lingers: how will the Union absorb its new lands without tearing itself apart? The answer, as the next part will reveal, lies in a war with Mexico, a war that delivered victory, but also a poisoned chalice of territory that reignited the central conflict. For the Republic, triumph would mean crisis reborn. The drums of manifest destiny beat louder in the 1842nd, and under President James K. Polk, they became the marching cadence of national policy. Polk, a Tennessean and protege of Andrew Jackson, entered the White House in 1845 with a clear agenda: annex Texas, secure Oregon, and if possible, extend the Republic all the way to California. He promised one term only, but in that term, he intended to redraw the continent. His confidence masked the peril. Expansion meant opportunity, but it also meant confrontation with Mexico, with Britain, and within America itself. Texas was the fuse. Mexico had never recognized the Lone Star Republic's independence, and Polk's decision to annex it was a direct insult. The disputed border between Texas and Mexico was the spark. Mexico claimed the Nueces River. The United States insisted on the Rio Grande. In early 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to march his army into the contested zone. Skirmishes broke out. When Mexican troops ambushed an American patrol, Polk declared that American blood has been shed upon American soil. Congress, inflamed, voted for war. The Mexican-American War was swift and decisive, though not without cost. Taylor's army swept south, winning victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey. General Winfield Scott, the old hero of 1812, led a bold amphibious landing at Veracruz and drove inland to Mexico City. By September 1847, U.S. troops raised their flag over the National Palace. For a young nation, it was intoxicating proof of military strength. For soldiers who fought in the dusty plains and volcanic ridges, it was also a brutal lesson in bloodshed, disease, and hardship. Thousands perished from dysentery and fever before ever facing musket fire. Among those marching across Mexico were young officers whose names would later echo through Civil War battlefields: Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall, Jackson, George Meade. They gained experience in logistics, reconnaissance, and command. They also witnessed the horrors of battle firsthand. Grant later reflected that the war was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. His words echoed the misgivings voiced by critics at home, including a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who challenged Polk's justification in his spot resolutions, demanding to know the exact spot where American blood had been shed. Yet Polk pressed forward, and victory brought spoils. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded to the United States an immense swath of territory: California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The map of America was transformed overnight. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the dream of manifest destiny was realized, but the triumph was poisoned. Every acre of new land reopened. The central question: would slavery expand? The Wilmot Proviso, introduced in Congress during the war, sought to ban slavery in any territory gained from Mexico. Southerners exploded in fury. Northerners rallied to the cause. Though the proviso failed to pass, it became a lightning rod. The war had ended Mexico's claim, but it ignited a new conflict within America's soul. Each debate over the new territories hardened sectional lines. Northerners feared a slave power conspiracy. Southerners warned that any limit on slavery was an assault on their rights and honor. On the ground, the new lands were not empty, but filled with people. Mexicans who became American citizens overnight, native nations whose lands were once more in jeopardy, settlers rushing west with dreams of gold, trade, and farms. California, in particular, drew fevered attention. Within a year of the treaty, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill would unleash a rush unlike anything the young republic had seen. With it came the urgent question, how would California enter the Union? The Mexican War was both a triumph and a tragedy. It fulfilled a dream of continental power, yet it shattered illusions that expansion could occur without consequence. Victory over Mexico was swift. Peace at home was fragile. Even as the treaty ink dried, Americans whispered anxiously, what bargain, if any, could keep North and South from tearing apart? The Missouri line, the old compromise, suddenly looked flimsy against the vast lands of the Southwest. And so, as this chapter ends, the nation stands larger but more divided. Expansion, once a promise, had become a curse. Next, we turn to the compromise of 1850, California's admission, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the moral firestorm that would set abolitionists and slaveholders on an irrevocable collision course. The Mexican War left America triumphant but uneasy. Vast new territories demanded settlement and statehood, yet each decision threatened to shatter the fragile balance between free and slave states. California, with its gold fields swelling in population, forced the issue. By 1850, tens of thousands had poured into the Sierra Nevada foothills. Towns exploded overnight, merchants prospered, and chaos reigned. California, eager to stabilize its wild society, petitioned for admission as a free state. The request set Washington ablaze. To Southerners, a free California meant Northern dominance in the Senate. To Northerners, rejecting California's petition meant betraying the very principle of self-government. The standoff threatened secession. Into this storm stepped an aging triumvirate of statesmen, Henry Clay of Kentucky, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Clay, once again, the great compromiser, crafted a package of measures. First, admit California as a free state. Second, allow the remaining Mexican cession territories, Utah and New Mexico, to decide for themselves through popular sovereignty, letting settlers vote on slavery. Third, abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C., though not slavery itself. Finally, and most controversially, strengthen the fugitive slave law to appease the South. This bundle, Clay insisted, was the only way to preserve the Union. Debate raged for months. Webster pleaded for conciliation in his famous 7th of March speech, urging Northerners to accept compromise for the sake of unity. Calhoun, gravely ill, warned that continued assaults on slavery would destroy the South's place in the Union. Clay himself, weary and frail, urged his colleagues to sacrifice pride for survival. In the end, it was Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois who shepherded the measures through Congress, splitting the package into separate bills to gather support. By September 1850, the compromise passed. For a moment, relief spread. The Union had survived another crisis. California entered free balancing, was reshuffled, and both sides claimed partial victories. Yet beneath the surface, the compromise was a devil's bargain. Its most explosive element, the Fugitive Slave Act, would radicalize Northern opinion like no event before it. The new law mandated federal officials to aid in capturing escaped slaves, imposed heavy penalties on anyone who harbored or assisted fugitives, and denied accused runaways the right to testify on their own behalf. Commissioners received more pay for returning a black person to slavery than for declaring them free. To abolitionists, this was legalized kidnapping. To Southern planters, it was long overdue protection of property rights. The law made every street in Boston, New York, or Chicago a potential hunting ground. Suddenly, slavery was no longer a distant institution, it intruded into northern lives. Resistance surged. Vigilance committees formed to warn fugitives of danger. The Underground Railroad intensified with figures like Harriet Tubman guiding dozens northward to Canada. Writers and preachers thundered against the law. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that personalized the cruelty of slavery for millions of readers. President Lincoln would later tell Stowe, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." While exaggerated, the remark captured the novel's seismic impact. Federal enforcement inflamed tensions further. In Boston, crowds tried to rescue Anthony Burns, a fugitive arrested under the act. Troops marched him through the streets under armed guard, but the spectacle only deepened Northern rage. Southern newspapers denounced the North's defiance, insisting that the law was part of the bargain that kept the Union intact. Each side accused the other of betrayal. By the mid-1852, the Compromise of 1850 looked less like a solution and more like a pause before greater violence. California had entered, yes, but popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico left the door open for new battles. The slave trade was gone from Washington's markets, but enslaved men and women still labored within sight of the Capitol dome. The Fugitive Slave Act, instead of cementing peace, had poured kerosene on a smoldering fire. Thus, as this chapter closes, the Union breathes but chokes on its own contradictions. Compromise after compromise keeps the frame intact, but every patch makes the structure more brittle. Ahead lies Kansas, Nebraska, and the undoing of even the Missouri line itself. The prairie will ignite, and blood will stain the soil. The truce of 1850 is no peace. It is only the calm before the storm. The uneasy peace of the Compromise of 1850 lasted only a few years. In the early 1852 westward expansion demanded fresh answers. Railroads promised to link the Atlantic with the Pacific, and developers lobbied for routes across the Great Plains. But the question that haunted every surveyor's line was the same: would new lands be free or slave? Into this volatile atmosphere stepped Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, an ambitious, energetic figure with national aspirations. Douglas believed the answer lay in democracy itself. Let the settlers decide. His solution would become the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it would rip open wounds the nation could no longer ignore. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a clear line across the Louisiana Purchase, banning slavery north of latitude 36°30. For decades that line had served as a crude truce. Douglas, eager to organize the vast plains into formal territories to pave the way for a transcontinental railroad, proposed to sweep the line aside. His bill, introduced in 1854, created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and declared that the status of slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty. Settlers themselves would vote free or slave. On the surface, it looked like democratic fairness. In reality, it reopened every bitter argument the Missouri line had kept buried. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Southerners celebrated. At last, the door was open for slavery to expand into lands once closed. Northern outrage was volcanic. To many, repealing the Missouri line was nothing short of betrayal. Newspapers thundered that the South was extending its slave power conspiracy, twisting the Union into a tool for bondage. The political fallout was equally dramatic. Old parties cracked apart. The Whig Party, long a rival to the Democrats, collapsed under the strain. In its place arose a new coalition, the Republican Party, founded on the principle of halting slavery's expansion. In taverns and town halls, men who had never stood together, anti-slavery, Democrats, former Whigs, free soilers, suddenly found common cause under the Republican banner. On the ground, the consequences were even bloodier. Kansas, unlike Nebraska, sat directly in the path of settlement. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri streamed across the border, determined to shape the territory's fate. Anti-slavery settlers, many backed by northern emigrant aid societies, poured in to resist them. The prairie became a battlefield before statehood was even granted. Rival capitals emerged: pro-slavery Lecompton and anti-slavery Topeka. Fraudulent elections were staged ballot boxes, stuffed legislatures contested. The soil of Kansas, rich and fertile, was watered not just with rain, but with blood. This conflict would earn the territory a grim name: Bleeding Kansas. Back in Washington, the debates turned violent too. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech denouncing the crime against Kansas. Days later, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina strode into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner nearly to death with a cane. The attack shocked the North and thrilled much of the South. The floor of Congress had become an extension of the battlefield. The Union itself seemed to stagger under the blows. For Douglas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was meant to be a pragmatic solution, a way to clear obstacles to progress and allow democracy to work. Instead, it destroyed the fragile balance, shattered old alliances, and lit prairie fires of violence and fury. Newspapers in 1854 captured the mood with grim precision. Compromise was dead. The Kansas experiment had shown that popular sovereignty was not a salve, but a spark. By the mid-1852, the sectional divide was no longer a political quarrel, but a cultural chasm. Families in New England read Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin with tears and outrage. Planters in Mississippi warned their sons to prepare for war to defend Southern honor. Immigrants arriving in Chicago or St. Louis were drawn into local conflicts, forced to choose sides. The new Republican Party rallied around a simple yet powerful slogan: free soil, free labor, free men. For millions, it offered a vision of America where the frontier belonged not to slavery, but to opportunity. And so this chapter ends with a land on fire. Kansas is not yet a state, but already it bleeds. The Missouri line, once thought permanent, lies in tatters. A new political party rises from the ashes of the old. The Union still stands, but the foundations crack louder with each passing year. Ahead lies open war within Kansas, the Supreme Court's fateful judgment, and an abolitionist raid that will shock the world. The prairie catches fire, and the flames will not be easily contained. Kansas was meant to be a proving ground for democracy, but it became a killing ground for the Union's ideals. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had thrown open the gates, and now settlers, agitators, and opportunists poured in each, determined to decide the fate of slavery in the territory. What should have been ballots and debate quickly turned into bullets and blood. Newspapers from Boston to New Orleans seized on the story, and the nation learned a new phrase: Bleeding Kansas. The first territorial elections in 1855 were a sham. Pro-slavery border ruffians from neighboring Missouri rode in armed columns to stuff ballot boxes and intimidate voters. Their fraud produced a legislature that enacted harsh pro-slavery laws, including making it a capital offense to aid fugitive slaves. Anti-slavery settlers refused to recognize the results. Instead, they drafted their own constitution in Topeka and established a rival government. Kansas now had two capitals, two governments, and no peace. Violence soon followed. Pro-slavery forces attacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence in 1856, smashing printing presses, looting homes, and burning buildings. The sack of Lawrence reverberated across the nation, proof that political compromise had given way to mob rule. Days later, abolitionist John Brown and his sons retaliated in the Pottawatomie Massacre, dragging 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes at night and hacking them to death with broadswords. Brown's actions horrified some, Northerners inspired others, and terrified Southerners who saw in him a glimpse of the slave insurrection they dreaded. Skirmishes spread across the prairie. Cabins were torched, families driven out, raids answered with counter-raids. Guerrilla war had come to the American frontier. Farmers carried rifles to plow their fields. Children grew up with the sound of gunfire in the distance. Kansas's rich soil was soaked with blood before it could grow wheat. Meanwhile, in Washington, the violence spilled into the halls of Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a fierce opponent of slavery, delivered his crime against Kansas speech, denouncing the pro-slavery conspiracy with blistering words. He mocked Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina with personal ridicule. Days later, Butler's relative Representative Preston Brooks strode into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner nearly unconscious with a cane. Blood ran down the senator's face as Brooks struck again and again. Sumner collapsed, barely surviving, and would not return to full duty for years. The attack electrified the nation. In the South, Brooks was hailed as a hero. Gifted canes inscribed, "Hit him again." In the North, Sumner was embraced as a martyr for freedom. Violence had entered not just the frontier, but the very chamber of government. The press fanned the flames. Northern newspapers ran lurid accounts of Kansas raids and Sumner's beating, fueling outrage. Southern editors dismissed Northern hysteria and defended honor as the highest principle. Sectional identities hardened. Neighbors who once debated politics over shared meals now refused to speak. Churches split along north-south lines. The question of slavery no longer seemed like a distant abstraction. It had become immediate, visceral, and personal. Kansas remained ungovernable. Constitutions were written, rejected, and rewritten. President Franklin Pierce, sympathetic to Southern interests, struggled to impose order, but only deepened distrust. Federal troops could keep large battles from erupting, but they could not extinguish the steady drumbeat of violence. The Kansas prairie became a mirror of the Union itself. Two visions of America locked in conflict, unable to compromise, unwilling to yield. By the late 1852nd, the phrase "bleeding Kansas" was shorthand for the nation's descent into crisis. Popular sovereignty had not resolved the question of slavery. It had unleashed a preview of civil war. John Brown emerged from the chaos, a hardened radical, convinced that slavery would never fall except through bloodshed. Others watching the turmoil came to the same grim conclusion. Kansas was not the exception, it was the warning. And so this chapter closes with violence, both on the prairie and in the capital. Ballots gave way to bayonets. Debate collapsed into assault. The Union had stepped across a threshold. Ahead lies the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, where the law itself would be wielded not as a shield for liberty, but as a weapon to strip millions of hope. If violence had entered the chamber, now injustice would enter the courtroom. The 1852nd had already shown America that violence could erupt on the frontier and even in Congress itself. But in 1857, the nation turned its eyes to the Supreme Court, hoping for clarity, perhaps even a calming judgment. Instead, the court delivered a decision that shook the Republic to its core. The case was Dred Scott versus Proof. Sanford and its ruling would strip away illusions that law could restrain the march of slavery. Dred Scott was an enslaved man from Missouri who had lived for years with his master in free territory, first in Illinois, then in Wisconsin, both closed to slavery under the Missouri Compromise. Scott argued that his residence on free soil made him a free man. With the help of anti-slavery lawyers, he pressed his case through state and federal courts. By the time it reached the Supreme Court, The stakes had grown far beyond Scott's fate. The entire nation waited. Could an enslaved man claim freedom through the courts? Could Congress regulate slavery in the territories? The answers would determine the very structure of the Union. On the 6th of March, 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered the court's opinion. The ruling stunned even hardened partisans. First, the court declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States. They had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. With those words, Taney slammed shut the courthouse doors to millions, denying them any legal standing. Second, the court ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise, long considered a sacred pact, was declared unconstitutional. Slavery by implication could spread anywhere in the nation's territories. Popular sovereignty, too, was cast into doubt. The balance of decades had collapsed in a single judgment. The reaction was explosive. In the South, jubilation. Planters hailed the ruling as vindication proof that their institution was secure and constitutionally protected. They believed slavery now had the law itself as a shield. In the North, outrage thundered. Newspapers condemned the decision as judicial tyranny. Abolitionists pointed to it as proof that the slave power had captured not just Congress, but the highest court. Even moderate Northerners who had clung to compromise now wondered whether the Union could be trusted to deliver justice at all. For Dred Scott and his family, the ruling was personal tragedy. Though later manumitted by his owners, his years of struggle ended in heartbreak. For the nation, the case revealed something larger. The machinery of law, instead of offering resolution, had become a weapon in the sectional struggle. Faith in institutions eroded. If the court declared that black men had no rights, what recourse was left but resistance? The political fallout was swift. The Republican Party, only a few years old, seized on the decision as a rallying cry. Leaders like Abraham Lincoln argued that the court had gone beyond its case, conspiring with pro-slavery forces to nationalize bondage. In speeches, Lincoln warned that if Dred Scott stood, nothing would prevent slavery from spreading into every state. Senator Stephen Douglas, defending his doctrine of popular sovereignty, struggled to square it with a ruling that denied territorial legislatures any authority. The political landscape fractured further, and debates turned sharper, darker, more personal. Ordinary Americans felt the tremors. In northern towns, free black communities lived with new fear. If citizenship itself was denied, what protections remained? In southern cities, elites boasted of their victory, while poor whites were reminded that the defense of slavery meant defending hierarchy itself. Churches, newspapers, and families split along sectional lines. Trust in national unity drained away, replaced by suspicion and dread. The Dred Scott decision did more than decide a case. It delegitimized compromise. If Congress could not ban slavery in the territories, then every political bargain since Missouri stood on sand. The court had given slavery not just protection but permanence. For those who opposed it, the path of ballots and courts seemed blocked. For those who supported it, the ruling was a green light to press further. Conflict now seemed inevitable, because law itself had declared one side powerless. Thus, this chapter closes with the darkest of questions. If the courts cannot check slavery, if Congress cannot contain it, if compromises are struck down as unconstitutional, what is left? The nation already bloodied in Kansas now faced a new reality. The very Constitution was read as a charter of bondage, and if law cannot stop it, what can? The Dred Scott ruling convinced many that the law itself had been chained to slavery. For radicals, the lesson was clear: the institution could not be voted out nor litigated away. One man, hardened in the fires of Kansas, decided that only direct action, only blood, could tear slavery from the Republic. His name was John Brown, and in 1859 His desperate gamble at Harper's Ferry would echo across the land, striking terror in the South and awakening hope in the North. Brown had been born in Connecticut in 1800, raised in a devout Calvinist household that preached both scripture and anti-slavery conviction. He failed at business, wandered across states, raised a large family, and lived much of his life in hardship. But in Kansas, Brown found his calling. There, amid the chaos of bleeding Kansas, he led raids against pro-slavery settlers, most infamously the Potawatomi killings. To his enemies, he was a fanatic murderer. To his allies, a soldier of God. Brown believed he was chosen to strike the blow that would end slavery. By the late 1852, he began to plan an audacious strike, not against individual settlers, but against the institution itself. His vision was bold. Even utopian: seize a federal arsenal, arm enslaved men, and spark a massive uprising across the South. The target was Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers met, guarded by hills but lightly defended. In October 1859, Brown and a band of 21 followers, including 5 African Americans, slipped into town by night. They captured the armory-cut telegraph wires and took hostages. Brown expected enslaved Virginians to rally to his side. Few came. Instead, townspeople raised the alarm, and local militia closed in. For 2 tense days, Brown and his men held out in the engine house, trapped and surrounded. Shots rang, townspeople fell, and Brown's sons lay dead beside him. The federal government, alarmed, dispatched U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, with young Jeb Stuart as aide. At dawn on the 18th of October, the Marines stormed the building. In minutes, it was over. Brown was captured, wounded but alive. His dream collapsed in smoke and blood. The raid itself was a failure, but its reverberations shook the nation. In the South, panic spread like wildfire. Planters saw Harper's Ferry not as an isolated incident, but as prophecy of insurrection. Memories of Nat Turner's rebellion still haunted them, and now they feared every barn and cabin might hide conspirators. Vigilance committees formed militias, drilled, and suspicion deepened toward Northerners. Ministers thundered that abolitionists meant not debate, but knives and fire. In the North, reactions were divided. Many disavowed Brown's violence, calling it reckless and misguided. Yet others, while rejecting his methods, admired his courage. At his trial in Virginia, Brown spoke with calm conviction, declaring that he acted in behalf of God's despised poor. His words, published in newspapers nationwide, transformed him from criminal to martyr. When he was hanged on the 2nd of December, crowds sang hymns, bells tolled in northern towns, and Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Christ on the cross, a song John Brown's body would later march with Union soldiers into battle. The trial and execution deepened sectional fear and fury. Southerners pointed to Northern sympathy for Brown as proof that the entire region conspired to destroy them. Even moderates were accused of harboring hidden John Browns. Northerners, meanwhile, saw in the harsh Southern reaction confirmation that the South would tolerate no dissent, no debate, no compromise. Brown had failed militarily, but politically he had widened the gulf beyond repair. Among the young men who witnessed Harper's Ferry were officers who would soon fight on opposite sides of a civil war. Robert E. Lee, who restored order for the Union, then later led the Confederacy, and future generals who carried memories of Brown's defiance into their commands. For them, Harper's Ferry was a prelude, a rehearsal for a conflict yet to come. As 1,860 approached, the raid lingered in every conversation. In taverns, churches, and town halls, Americans debated whether John Brown was a hero or a madman, a saint or a murderer. In reality, he was a symbol one too powerful to ignore. His raid made compromise harder, suspicion deeper, and fear more pervasive. The next national test, the presidential election, loomed just ahead. And in that contest, every alarm rung at Harper's Ferry would echo louder, shaping the outcome and propelling the nation closer to the brink. By 1860, the United States stood fractured in spirit, if not yet in law. The Kansas prairie had bled, the Supreme Court had sanctified bondage, and John Brown's gallows had become both Northern hymn and Southern nightmare. Into this cauldron came the presidential election, a contest that would decide not only who held office, but whether the Union itself would survive. 4 candidates, 4 visions of America and one nation, teetering at the edge of disunion. The Democratic Party, long a national force bridging North and South, split under the weight of slavery. At the Charleston Convention, delegates clashed over the party platform. Southern Democrats demanded a pledge to protect slavery in all territories. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen A. Douglas, clung to popular sovereignty. When compromise failed, Southern delegates stormed out. The party-fractured Douglas carried the Northern wing, while Southern Democrats nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, promising firm defense of slavery. Meanwhile, a new force rose in the North. The Republican Party, barely 6 years old, gathered strength from outrage over Kansas and Dred Scott. Their platform opposed the expansion of slavery, but stopped short of abolition where it already existed. They nominated Abraham Lincoln, a tall Illinois lawyer with a gift for plain speech. Lincoln was no abolitionist in the radical mold, but he embodied the Northern conviction that slavery must not spread further. His debates with Douglas 2 years earlier had showcased his clarity. A house divided against itself cannot stand. A fourth group, the Constitutional Union Party, sought to calm the storm by ignoring the slavery question altogether. Led by John Bell of Tennessee, they appealed to the Union, the Constitution, and the enforcement of the laws. It was a message of stability, but in a nation aflame, it sounded more like denial. As campaigns unfolded, the division was geographic as much as ideological. In the North, Lincoln's name appeared on ballots everywhere, while in much of the South his name did not appear at all. Southerners viewed him as the embodiment of Northern hostility, a symbol of the threat to their way of life. Breckinridge carried the Deep South, Douglas rallied pockets of border states, and the Midwest and Bell attracted moderates hoping against hope for compromise. The election of the 6th of November 1860 delivered a stark verdict. Lincoln won the presidency with a clear electoral majority, though less than 40% of the popular vote. Not a single Southern state cast its electoral votes for him. He was elected entirely by Northern strength. To the South, this was proof that their voice in the Union had been silenced. If a president could be chosen without them, what protection remained for their interests, their property, their honor? Celebrations erupted in Northern towns, but in Southern parlors and plantations, anger hardened into resolve. Leaders in South Carolina, long the most radical state in its threats of secession, declared that the Union was now broken. Newspapers in Charleston proclaimed that the state would no longer remain in a federation ruled by an enemy president. By December, South Carolina's legislature called a convention to vote on secession. The decision was swift and unanimous. The Palmetto State would leave the Union. The election of 1,860 was not merely a political event, it was a revelation. The nation was no longer one people choosing among leaders. It was two peoples inhabiting the same republic, but living in different moral worlds. Lincoln himself in Springfield spoke with humility, pledging to preserve the Union and promising not to interfere with slavery where it existed. But his reassurances could not reach Southern ears, deafened by fear and defiance. The ballots had spoken, and for many Southerners, the only answer was disunion. Thus this chapter closes with a fateful truth. Democracy had delivered a verdict, but that verdict fractured the Republic. South Carolina had already stepped toward the door, and other states would soon follow. The election, intended to settle disputes through peaceful means, instead hurled the nation toward the edge of war. Ahead lies secession, the birth of a rival confederacy, and the guns that will soon thunder at Fort Sumter. South Carolina decides, and the Union trembles. South Carolina's decision to secede in December 1860 shattered the illusion that threats of disunion were mere political theater. The act was swift, solemn, and final. Bells rang in Charleston, cannon boomed, and crowds celebrated as if independence had been reclaimed. Yet beyond the cheers hung a question that would soon engulf the entire republic. Would other southern states follow? Within weeks, the answer came. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas declared themselves out of the Union. By February 1861, 7 states had broken away, forming a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Delegates from the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama. They drafted a constitution resembling that of the United States, but with explicit protections for slavery and states' rights. For president, they chose Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War. Davis, tall and austere, spoke of the Confederacy not as rebellion, but as a rightful continuation of the American Revolution, claiming Southerners were merely asserting the principles of 1776 against tyranny. The mood in Montgomery was confident, even jubilant. Cotton was king, and many believed that the world, especially Britain and France, would recognize their independence rather than risk losing Southern exports. In the North, shock mingled with confusion. President James Buchanan, in his final lame duck months, dithered. He declared secession illegal, but insisted the federal government had no power to coerce a state back into the Union. His paralysis deepened the crisis. Banks trembled, trade faltered, and arsenals in the South were seized by secessionists almost without resistance. The Union seemed to be unraveling thread by thread. When Abraham Lincoln finally took the oath of office on the 4th of March 1861, he faced a nation already split. His inaugural address was calm but firm. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, but he declared secession void. The Union, he said, was perpetual, and he swore to hold, occupy, and possess federal property. His words were meant to reassure and to warn. Yet even as he spoke, forts in the South, symbols of federal authority, were isolated, surrounded, and threatened. The balance of power between Union and Confederacy was stark. The North possessed greater population, more industry, a larger navy, and a sprawling network of railroads. Its factories could churn out rifles and uniforms by the thousands, while the South relied heavily on imports. The North's farms produced wheat and corn, essential for feeding armies. The South, by contrast, grew cotton and tobacco cash crops that could not sustain soldiers. Yet Southerners took confidence in their martial spirit, their military tradition, and the belief that Northern men would not fight long for a cause so abstract as Union. They imagined one great victory would break Northern will and win foreign recognition. In parlors and taverns across America, ordinary citizens debated the meaning of secession. Northern families wondered if compromise might still be possible, if the Union could be patched yet again. Southern families, especially in the Cotton Belt, celebrated their new Confederacy, certain that their sons would soon defend it with honor. But border states, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, hovered uneasily, torn between ties to the South and loyalty to the Union. Their fate would determine whether the coming struggle was regional or total. The press mirrored the division. Northern newspapers pleaded for calm or demanded firmness, while Southern editors urged immediate defense of their sovereignty. Letters from soldiers and farmers alike revealed both excitement and dread. Many remembered the War of 1812, imagining another short, glorious conflict. Few grasped that they stood on the threshold of a war more devastating than the nation had ever endured. And so, as winter turned to spring in 1861, the stage was set. Two governments claimed legitimacy, two presidents issued proclamations, two peoples prepared for confrontation. The Union, larger and stronger, hesitated to strike first. The Confederacy, smaller but defiant, demanded recognition. Between them stood a handful of federal forts in southern harbors, silent but loaded with powder and shot. One spark, one cannon blast, would ignite the war that had long been whispered and feared. In Charleston Harbor, a lonely fortress stood as the final test of Union authority. Fort Sumter, built on an artificial island, commanded the entrance to the city's proud port. By early 1861, it was one of the last federal outposts in seceded territory, still under U.S. control. Inside its walls, Major Robert Anderson and fewer than 100 soldiers waited, surrounded by hostile forces and dwindling supplies. To the Confederacy, Sumter was an insult, a foreign garrison on sovereign soil. To Lincoln, it was a symbol of federal authority, proof that the Union still endured. Neither side could yield without sacrificing legitimacy. The guns of Charleston would decide. Through March and early April, the standoff deepened. Confederate officials demanded Anderson's surrender. Lincoln, newly inaugurated, faced his first crisis. He weighed his options carefully. To abandon Sumter would signal weakness, perhaps invite further secession. To reinforce it with soldiers risked open war. Lincoln chose a middle course. He would resupply the garrison with food, not arms, and he notified South Carolina of his intention. The message was clear. He would not fire first, but he would not abandon the flag. In Montgomery's seat of the young Confederacy, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet debated. Allowing the fort to be provisioned meant acknowledging federal control within their claimed borders. For secessionists, this was intolerable. At last, Davis ordered the guns of Charleston to act. On the 12th of April, 1861, before dawn, Confederate batteries under General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire. Shells arced across the harbor, exploding against the fort's brick walls. The thunder echoed through the city. Crowds gathered on rooftops and piazzas, watching the bombardment as if it were a festival. For 34 hours, cannon-roared flames licked the sky, and smoke shrouded the harbor. Anderson's men returned fire, but were hopelessly outgunned. On the 13th of April, the major surrendered. Remarkably, no one died during the bombardment itself, though one Union soldier was killed in an accident during the evacuation. Still, the symbolic death knell of peace had been sounded. News raced across the country by telegraph, electrifying the public. In the North, outrage surged. Lincoln issued a call for 7,500 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was overwhelming. Men flooded recruiting offices, bands played patriotic songs, towns held rallies. Some expected adventure, others vengeance, but few doubted the justice of the cause. In the South, the call to arms confirmed what many already believed, that Lincoln intended coercion, war, and subjugation. The Upper South, long hesitant, now moved. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded, swelling the Confederacy to 11 states. Richmond became the new capital, chosen for its industry and symbolism, a city just 100 miles from Washington. Families across the country felt the shift instantly. Young men kissed mothers and sweethearts goodbye, donning hastily sewn uniforms. Women organized aid societies, collected bandages, and prepared to send sons into danger. Churches held solemn prayers. Newspapers declared that history had turned. The United States, born of revolution, now faced a second great trial, this time against itself. Both sides brimmed with confidence. Southerners believed their martial culture, superior generals, and defensive position would secure independence quickly. They compared themselves to the patriots of 1,776 fighting tyranny against long odds. Northerners, buoyed by industry and population, expected the rebellion to collapse within months. Politicians predicted that one decisive battle would bring seceded states back into line. Neither side imagined the scale of sacrifice ahead, nor the rivers of blood soon to flow. The guns at Fort Sumter did more than signal war. They closed the era of compromise-shattered illusions of peace and forced every American to choose a side. Union or Confederacy, freedom or slavery, nation or disunion lines once blurred were now drawn in fire. The war that began in Charleston Harbor would stretch from Virginia to Texas, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, testing the Republic's endurance. The spark had been struck. The blaze would not be easily quenched. And so this chapter closes with hope and hubris intertwined. Young volunteers marched in neat columns, confident of quick victory. Families cheered them on, believing they would return by Christmas. But war has its own rhythm indifferent to optimism. Ahead lies the first great clash at Bull Run, where illusions will meet reality, and the nation will learn that its trial has only begun. Both sides expect a short war, but destiny has written a different story. The thunder of Fort Sumter had awakened a sleeping giant, but in the first months of war many still imagined a swift and decisive struggle. In northern parlors, men boasted they would march to Richmond and end the rebellion within 90 days. In southern towns, speeches promised that one glorious battle would secure independence. Neither side understood what was coming. The illusion would collapse on a hot July day in Virginia at a small stream called Bull Run. By summer 1861, pressure mounted on President Lincoln to strike. Newspapers clamored for action, politicians demanded victory, and volunteers, their enlistments ticking away, grew restless. General Irvin McDowell, cautious and aware his army was untested, nonetheless marched from Washington with 3,500 men. Their blue uniforms were fresh, their muskets barely fired, their spirits high. Families and dignitaries followed in carriages carrying picnic baskets and opera glasses, eager to watch the Union crush the rebellion. The war they believed would be a spectacle. Across the hills, Confederate forces, under General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, prepared defenses near the railroad junction at Manassas, Virginia. Reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston rushed from the Shenandoah Valley by rail, one of the first great troop movements by train in military history. Among Beauregard's brigadiers was Thomas Jonathan Jackson, a stern professor from Virginia Military Institute, who would soon earn a name etched into legend. On the 21st of July, Union troops crossed Bull Run Creek and launched their attack. At first, success seemed within reach. Confederate lines wavered, units fell back, and Union cheers rose. But on Henry House Hill, Jackson's brigade held firm. As fire raked the field, Jackson stood unflinching, rallying his Virginians. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," shouted General Barnard B. moments before falling mortally wounded. The name stuck. Jackson's stand bought precious time, and Confederate reinforcements poured in. The tide turned. As the day wore on, confusion and exhaustion spread through Union ranks. Smoke clouded the fields, orders tangled regiments, collapsed into panic. What began as a steady retreat became a chaotic rout. Soldiers dropped muskets and fled toward Washington, clogging roads with wagons and terrified civilians. Politicians and families who had come to picnic found themselves caught in the stampede. Carriages overturned artillery, abandoned men trampled. The reality of war had arrived with brutal clarity. For the Confederates, the victory was intoxicating. Cheers erupted across the South, where many believed independence was now assured. Jefferson Davis rode onto the battlefield to bask in triumph. Yet the Confederacy, too, had tasted the chaos of amateur armies. Units disorganized by their own pursuit of the enemy supply lines, frayed, and opportunities to march on Washington were lost. Still, the message was clear: the rebellion would not collapse easily, and Southern soldiers had proved their mettle. In the North, shock descended like a pall. Newspapers that had clamored for action now chronicled disaster. Families scanned casualty lists with dread. Confidence in military leadership evaporated. McDowell was replaced by General George B. McClellan, a young officer hailed as the young Napoleon tasked with rebuilding the shattered army. Camps sprouted around Washington, drills intensified, and the Union girded itself for a longer, bloodier war. The easy victory promised in spring had dissolved into nightmare by midsummer. For soldiers on both sides, Bull Run was a baptism of fire. Young men who had left home in a blaze of patriotic fervor returned broken, wounded, or not at all. Survivors carried memories of comrades falling in heaps of shells, tearing through ranks of blood, soaking fields once meant for picnics. The war no longer belonged to speeches and parades. It belonged to powder smoke and death. Bull Run marked the end of innocence. The Republic North and South now understood that the struggle ahead would demand more than enthusiasm. It would require endurance, sacrifice, and blood on a scale few could imagine. The Union capital lay shaken, its defenses hastily strengthened. The Confederacy, emboldened, believed even more strongly in its destiny. Washington looked vulnerable, and the long war had begun. The rout at Bull Run shattered illusions, but did not end the war. It expanded it. By late 1861, the conflict stretched far beyond the fields of Virginia. Both Union and Confederacy realized they faced a struggle of endurance, not spectacle. Mobilization quickened, new theaters opened, and diplomacy loomed as foreign nations watched closely. The war, once imagined as a brief quarrel, widened into a continental crisis. In Missouri, a bitter struggle for control erupted. The state, officially in the Union, was torn by divided loyalties. Pro-Confederate forces under General Sterling Price clashed with Union troops commanded by Nathaniel Lyon. At Wilson's Creek in August 1861, Lyon's smaller Union army fought valiantly, but was overwhelmed. Lyon became the first Union general killed in the war, his body carried from the field as his men retreated. Missouri descended into chaos. Guerrilla bands roamed the countryside, families were uprooted, and the border war grew savage. The struggle for Missouri showed that the war was not simply North versus South, but often neighbor against neighbor. Farther west, the mountains of Virginia told another story. In the rugged counties along the Ohio River, Unionist sentiment ran strong. When Virginia seceded, many in the Northwest refused to follow. Protected by Union armies, they declared loyalty to the United States and began the process of forming a new state. By 1863, West Virginia would officially join the Union, born directly from the fracture of secession. The mountains had spoken against the tide. On the seas and coasts, Union strategy began to show its reach. The Navy, expanding rapidly, moved to enforce the Anaconda Plan, a blockade intended to choke the Confederacy's trade. Union forces seized Hatteras Inlet in North Carolina and Port Royal in South Carolina, establishing beachheads for future campaigns. Though the blockade was porous at first, every captured port tightened the noose. Southern commerce faltered as cotton piled up unsold, and the promise of King Cotton diplomacy grew less certain. Diplomacy, however, nearly ignited war abroad. In November 1861, the USS San Jacinto intercepted the British mail packet Trent in the Caribbean, seizing 2 Confederate envoys bound for Europe. News of the Trent affair provoked outrage in Britain, where many demanded war against the United States for violating neutral rights. Lincoln and his cabinet, aware of the danger, released the envoys with careful words. One war at a time, Lincoln remarked. The incident underscored how fragile international relations were and how vital it was for the Union to avoid giving Britain or France cause to recognize the Confederacy. Back in Washington, the Union Army swelled. Hundreds of thousands of men poured into camps, drilling under new commanders. McClellan, placed in charge of the Army of the Potomac, imposed discipline, organization, and training. Soldiers admired his attention to detail and his insistence on preparation. Politicians, however, grew impatient with his caution. The capital, ringed with fortifications and bristling with cannon, felt secure, but no great offensive stirred. All quiet on the Potomac became a bitter refrain in northern newspapers. The Confederacy, too, prepared for a longer fight. Richmond, now its capital, bustled with activity. Armories and foundries worked to supply muskets and artillery, yet shortages already pinched. The blockade cut into trade inflation, nipped at households, and supplies were scarce. Still, morale ran high. The victory at Bull Run convinced many Southerners that one more triumph could bring recognition from Europe and secure independence. Jefferson Davis urged his people to endure, invoking sacrifice and honor as the Confederacy's foundation. For ordinary Americans, late 1861 marked a transition. The war had begun as a political dispute, but now it consumed daily life. Families sent sons to the front, women organized relief societies, farmers delivered grain to feed armies. Letters carried both pride and worry, pride in service, fear of loss. Cemeteries grew, hospitals overflowed, and yet both sides braced themselves for a fight they insisted must go on. As winter approached, the Union and Confederacy faced a stalemate in the east. The Potomac River lay between two great armies, each glaring at the other, but unwilling or unable to strike. Lincoln's cabinet fretted over strategy, impatient for decisive movement. McClellan built an army, but offered no battle. The South waited confident, but strained. Abroad, Britain and France watched, wondering whether this American conflict would fracture the Republic forever. The war widened, but direction was unclear. The nation braced for the next campaigns, knowing the cost would only grow. Thus, the chapter ends with uncertainty. The Union grows stronger, yet paralyzed by inaction. The Confederacy celebrates defiance, yet feels the pinch of blockade. Strategy at the top is unsettled, and the road ahead winds into bloodier years. The opening phase has ended. A deeper, harsher war now beckons. While armies in Virginia stared at one another across the Potomac, the war's momentum shifted westward in early 1862. The great rivers of the Mississippi Valley became highways of invasion, and the Union discovered that mastery of water and iron could break open the Confederacy's heartland. Here in Tennessee, Kentucky, and along the Gulf, the war widened into a brutal contest of forts, fleets, and fields. The campaign opened in February, when Union General Ulysses S. Grant, little known at the time, led a bold offensive against Confederate positions guarding the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Supported by Flag Officer Andrew Foote's ironclad gunboats, Grant struck first at Fort Henry on the Tennessee. The gunboats' heavy shells battered the fort into submission almost before Grant's infantry arrived. Days later, Grant turned on Fort Donelson along the Cumberland. Here, resistance was fierce. Confederate generals debated escape or surrender, but Grant demanded nothing less than unconditional and immediate surrender. The phrase caught headlines, and unconditional surrender Grant became a national name. With Donelson's fall, thousands of Confederates marched into captivity, and Kentucky and much of Tennessee opened to Union control. The victories sent shockwaves through the South. Nashville fell without a fight, its citizens stunned by the sudden arrival of Union troops. Confederate lines in the West buckled, and morale sagged. For the North, jubilations surged. At last, concrete victories replaced the gloom of Bull Run. Grant, once obscure and twice a failure in civilian life, was now hailed as a rising star. But the West would offer no easy triumphs. In April 1862, Grant advanced deeper into Tennessee, encamping near Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. His men, many green recruits, lounged and drilled, unaware of the storm about to break. At dawn on the 6th of April, Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a massive surprise attack. The Battle of Shiloh exploded in smoke and horror. Union camps were overrun, soldiers fled in confusion, and the roar of musketry echoed through the woods. Johnston himself fell mortally wounded, but his army pressed hard. Only desperate resistance, anchored by Grant's determination and the timely arrival of reinforcements, saved the Union Army from destruction. On the second day, Grant counterattacked, driving the Confederates from the field. Shiloh stunned the nation. More than 23,000 casualties littered the fields, more Americans killed or wounded in 2 days than in all previous wars combined. Piles of dead and groaning wounded shocked soldiers who had marched off expecting glory. Newspapers recoiled, critics denounced Grant as careless, but he remained steadfast. "I propose to fight it out," he said. The war, Shiloh proved, would be long and ghastly. Innocence was gone. Endurance alone would decide. Even as Shiloh scarred Tennessee Union forces struck farther south, on the 25th of April, Flag Officer David Farragut's fleet of wooden warships braved fire from Confederate forts to steam up the Mississippi and seize New Orleans. The capture was a devastating blow. New Orleans, the South's largest city and commercial hub, fell into Union hands, its citizens bitter and humiliated. The Confederacy lost control of its greatest port, and the Mississippi's lower reaches now belonged to the Union Navy. Step by step, the Union tightened its grip on the rivers. Gunboats patrolled waters once thought secure, while armies pushed along the banks. The Mississippi, that great artery of America, became both battlefield and prize. For the Confederacy, holding it was vital to survival. For the Union, seizing it was the key to cutting the South in two. With Kentucky and Tennessee pierced, with New Orleans captured, the Union's long Anaconda Plan began to squeeze. Yet one citadel remained: Vicksburg, Mississippi. Perched high on bluffs commanding a bend in the river, Vicksburg was the fortress city the Union could not bypass. As long as Vicksburg stood, the Confederacy's western half was linked to the east. Lincoln himself declared Vicksburg is the key. The struggle for that key lay ahead, but already the outlines of total war were visible. Fields burned, civilians displaced cities, occupied rivers choked with gunboats. The Mississippi Valley was no longer the nation's breadbasket, it was a battlefield. Thus, this chapter ends with the Union triumphant in the West, but facing the grim truth of Shiloh's carnage. The rivers belonged increasingly to the Union Navy, but the bluffs of Vicksburg still loomed. Ahead lies the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia, where George McClellan will march on Richmond and Robert E. Lee will rise to command. Strategy, blood, and destiny converge as the war enters a harsher phase. One citadel still bars the river, and one general still waits in the wings. While Union gunboats carved paths through the western rivers, eyes in Washington turned back to Virginia, where the Confederacy's capital at Richmond stood only 100 miles from the Union's seat of power. To Northern leaders, capturing Richmond promised swift victory. To Southern hearts, defending it meant survival. Into this stage stepped General George B. McClellan, commander of the newly forged Army of the Potomac, a force of more than 1,000,000 men. Young, ambitious, and meticulous McClellan inspired his soldiers with confidence, but frustrated politicians with caution. In the spring of 1862, he launched the Grand Peninsula Campaign, an attempt to end the war by seizing Richmond from the southeast. McClellan's plan was bold on paper. He ferried his immense army by water to the Virginia Peninsula, between the York and James Rivers, intending to advance up toward Richmond. Yet from the start, delays plagued him. He overestimated Confederate numbers entrenched at Yorktown and spent weeks digging siege lines instead of pressing forward. His hesitation allowed Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston to maneuver and prepare. Meanwhile, Washington grew restless. Lincoln urged speed, but McClellan insisted that prudence was essential to avoid disaster. The campaign that was meant to be rapid bogged down in mud, rain, and indecision. In late May, Johnston struck back at 7 Pines east of Richmond. The battle was fierce, chaotic, fought through swampy woods and tangled underbrush. Union forces were caught off guard, but rallied under heavy fire. The clash cost thousands of casualties on both sides. For the Confederacy, it brought a sudden change of destiny. Johnston was gravely wounded, carried from the field. Into the void stepped his second-in-command, General Robert E. Lee. Lee, a Virginian of patrician bearing and West Point honor, had long been respected but little tested in high command. Now, with Richmond in peril, he took the reins of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. His arrival changed everything. Where Johnston had been cautious, Lee was daring. Where McClellan hesitated, Lee seized initiative. Almost immediately, he began reorganizing defenses and planning counterblows. His charisma and confidence rallied officers and soldiers alike. Richmond, teetering, now had a new defender. McClellan inched closer, his siege lines tightening. He could see Richmond's spires from his headquarters, yet he moved as if paralyzed by his own fears of phantom Confederate armies. Reports from scouts convinced him he was outnumbered, when in reality he held superiority. His telegrams to Washington brimmed with pleas for reinforcements, complaints of neglect and warnings of looming disaster. Lincoln, exasperated, sent troops piecemeal, but doubted his general's resolve. "If McClellan is not using the army," Lincoln remarked tartly, "I should like to borrow it for a time." As Lee assumed command, his vision became clear. He would not sit behind Richmond's fortifications awaiting siege. Instead, he planned to strike. In the weeks ahead, his audacity would erupt in the 7 days' battles, where McClellan's grand campaign would unravel under relentless Confederate counterattacks. But in the spring of 1862, as Johnston lay wounded and Lee stepped forward, the transformation was just beginning. The Confederacy had found its champion. For soldiers in the ranks, the peninsula was misery. Rain turned roads into quagmires, supplies lagged, disease stalked camps. Union soldiers wrote of endless waiting, of trenches dug of Richmond, so close they imagined hearing its church bells. Confederate troops, leaner and fewer, endured just as harsh conditions, but found new hope in Lee's leadership. Both sides sensed that the struggle for Richmond would be decisive. The Peninsula Campaign promised quick triumph, but delivered stalemate and frustration. McClellan's army remained intact, but his chance at crushing the Confederacy early slipped away. Lee, little known beyond military circles before 7 Pines, now stood as the South's great hope. A new maestro had taken the stage, and his bold strokes would soon reshape the war. Thus this chapter closes with the curtain rising on Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, whose daring would both inspire and imperil the South. McClellan, still camped within sight of Richmond, hesitated. Lee, untested, but eager, prepared to seize the initiative. The drama of the war's Eastern theater had entered a new act, one that would carry the nation into battles bloodier than any yet seen. The summer of 1862 marked the Confederacy's boldest gamble yet. After frustrating McClellan on the peninsula and striking fiercely in the 7 days' battles, Robert E. Lee pressed northward. His aim was daring: carry the war into Union territory, relieve pressure on Virginia's ravaged fields, inspire Marylanders to join the Southern cause, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, win a victory so decisive it would secure foreign recognition from Britain or France. The stakes were immense, and every step carried the Confederacy deeper into danger. Lee's army of Northern Virginia, hardened by months of fighting but worn by hunger and disease, crossed the Potomac in September. Songs of Maryland. My Maryland rang through the ranks, though local enthusiasm proved tepid. The Union, stunned by earlier defeats, scrambled to respond. President Lincoln turned to General George B. McClellan once more. Restored to command after the debacle of Second Bull Run, McClellan moved cautiously, shadowing Lee's advance. Fate intervened when Union soldiers discovered a mislaid copy of Lee's battle orders wrapped around cigars. The lost order revealed the Confederate plan in startling detail. For once, McClellan held a priceless advantage. Yet his caution blunted its impact, allowing Lee to gather his scattered forces near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along the Antietam Creek. On the 17th of September 1862, the fields and cornrows of Antietam bore witness to the bloodiest single day in American history. At dawn, Union troops surged against Lee's left through a cornfield so dense with smoke and musket fire that survivors later swore stalks were cut down like grass. Thousands fell within minutes. The battle rolled south to a sunken farm lane, soon choked with Confederate dead the bloody lane. Further still, at a stone bridge spanning Antietam Creek, Union troops charged repeatedly against a handful of Georgian defenders, finally crossing at staggering cost. Everywhere the ground ran red, the air filled with cries, powder smoke, and the roar of artillery. By sunset, over 2,000 men lay killed, wounded, or missing. Never before had Americans endured such carnage in a single day. Militarily, Antietam was a stalemate. Lee held his ground through sheer resolve, but was forced to retreat across the Potomac days later. For the Confederacy, the invasion had failed to deliver the knockout blow. For the Union, though far from a clear victory, it was enough a check to Lee's advance, a halt to Southern momentum. McClellan, ever cautious, refused to pursue aggressively, squandering the chance to destroy Lee's army. Lincoln's frustration deepened, but the president saw in the battle an opportunity not measured solely in casualties or ground. Internationally, Antietam mattered enormously. Britain and France had watched the war with interest, their industries hungry for Southern cotton. Recognition of the Confederacy remained a possibility, especially if Southern arms triumphed on Northern soil. But Lee's retreat after Antietam weakened the case. European leaders hesitated, unwilling to back a rebellion that could not secure clear victories. The Union, battered yet standing still, commanded legitimacy abroad. At home, Lincoln recognized the moment's political weight. For months he had drafted a proclamation to transform the war's purpose. Until now he had insisted the struggle was for union, not emancipation, fearing to alienate border states. But, with Antietam halting, Lee Lincoln judged the time ripe. On the 22nd of September, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation unless the seceded states returned to the Union by the 1st of January 1863, all enslaved people within their borders would be declared free. It was both a moral stroke and a calculated act of war. Emancipation would weaken the Confederacy's labor force, strengthen the Union's cause, and close the door on European intervention. For Britain and France could scarcely ally with a power fighting to preserve slavery. For soldiers in the field, the meaning of Antietam was etched not in proclamations, but in memory. Survivors wrote of comrades falling in heaps of fences, splintered by bullets of fields littered with bodies beyond count. Civilians in Sharpsburg staggered through wreckage, their homes pierced by cannon fire, their wells fouled with the dead. Antietam revealed war's true face, endless, pitiless grinding. Yet from this carnage emerged a pivot. The Union had not triumphed outright, but it had gained the ground Lincoln needed to redefine the conflict. The war for Union would now also be a war for freedom, at least in promise. Whether that promise could be realized remained uncertain. The proclamation was conditional, its reach limited, but its meaning immense. A new phase beckoned, and with it new hopes and new perils. Thus this chapter ends with Lee back across the Potomac, the Union bloodied but standing, and Lincoln preparing to strike with words that would change the war's character. A proclamation conditional and calculated, waited on the horizon, poised to transform the Republic forever. On the first day of 1863, the war for Union officially became a war for freedom. Abraham Lincoln, pen in hand, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the conflict's moral core. The decision was the product of months of calculation and anguish, born of battlefield necessity and moral conviction. Antietam's bloody stalemate had given Lincoln the opportunity he needed. Now he seized it, redefining the nation's purpose in the midst of its darkest trial. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves in states in rebellion against the United States were henceforth free. Its scope was sweeping yet limited. It did not apply to the border states Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware that had remained in the Union, nor to areas of the Confederacy already under Union control. Lincoln knew he lacked the constitutional authority to abolish slavery everywhere outright. But as commander-in-chief, he claimed the measure as a wartime necessity, depriving the Confederacy of its labor force and striking at the institution that underpinned its economy and armies. To enslaved people across the South, the proclamation was a beacon. Though its words could not instantly shatter chains in rebel territory, it carried the promise of liberty wherever Union troops advanced. Enslaved men, women, and children listened for news, whispered its contents, and fled toward Union lines whenever possible. Each step toward Union camps became an act of self-emancipation. Soldiers wrote home of families arriving in ragged clothes, faces alight with hope. The war once fought to preserve a union of states now carried the weight of human liberation. The proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to serve in uniform. Lincoln authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. At first, skepticism and prejudice reigned among many whites, but soon regiments formed the 54th Massachusetts, being the most famous. By war's end, nearly 2,000,000, black men would wear Union blue, their courage reshaping perceptions and lending fresh strength to the Northern cause. For them, the war was not abstract politics, but the struggle for their own freedom and that of their families. Internationally, emancipation struck like a thunderclap. European powers, particularly Britain, had wavered on recognition of the Confederacy tempted by Southern cotton. Now, with the Union fighting explicitly against slavery, alignment with the South became untenable. Britain, long committed to abolition, could not ally with a nation built on bondage. Lincoln had closed the door to foreign recognition of the Confederacy with a stroke of his pen. The war's diplomatic field shifted as decisively as its moral one. Reactions at home were mixed. Abolitionists rejoiced, praising Lincoln for finally wielding federal power against slavery. Many Union soldiers, indifferent or hostile to emancipation, at first grumbled that they had enlisted to save the Union, not to free slaves. Democrats in the North denounced the proclamation as reckless, predicting it would prolong the war. Yet over time, as black regiments proved their valor in battle, Northern opinion shifted. The cause of union and the cause of freedom grew entwined, inseparable. For Confederates, the proclamation was incendiary. Leaders denounced it as incitement to servile insurrection, proof that the Union aimed not just to subdue the South, but to destroy its social order. Enslaved people themselves made the proclamation real. fleeing plantations, slowing work, resisting wherever possible. The Confederate war effort strained as its labor force dissolved piece by piece. Every step of Union advance now carried a shadow army of freed people, reshaping the landscape. Lincoln himself felt the weight of history in that moment. Witnesses described his quiet gravity as he signed the document on January, his hand trembling slightly from hours of shaking celebratory hands. "If my name ever goes into history," he said, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." He knew the proclamation was imperfect, limited, fragile in law, yet it was also irreversible. Once the war became a fight for freedom, no peace could be made without it. For soldiers in the field, the winter of 1863 was bitter. Camps were cold supplies, thin morale uncertain. But above the smoke of campfires rose a new sense of purpose. Letters home spoke of the proclamation's promise. The Union was no longer fighting merely to preserve what had been. It was fighting to create something new. The stakes had risen, the cost deepened, but the cause ennobled. Thus, this chapter closes with a question. The proclamation has altered the moral compass of the war, invited black men into the ranks, and denied the Confederacy foreign aid. But can new soldiers, untested and doubted, truly shift the battlefield ahead? Lies proof at places like Port Hudson and Fort Wagner, where black regiments will face fire and answer with courage. The proclamation has been written, now history will test whether its promise can stand. Will new soldiers change the field? The year 1863 opened, with emancipation declared and the stakes redrawn. But as the war deepened, so did the burdens on both nations. Neither Union nor Confederacy could sustain armies of such size and campaigns of such scope without pressing ever harder on the resources and liberties of their people. Draft laws' dissent and economic strain defined the year-testing determination on both sides, even before the clash of great battles. If the front lines demanded courage, the home front demanded endurance. For the Confederacy, manpower was already strained. The South's smaller population and reliance on enslaved labor meant that free white men were stretched thin. In April 1862, the Confederate Congress had passed the first national draft law in American history, requiring all white men aged 18 to 35 to serve. By 1863, the burden widened as casualties mounted. The law was deeply unpopular, especially provisions that allowed wealthy planters to avoid service if they owned 20 or more enslaved people. Critics called it a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Desertions rose, discontent simmered, and loyalty frayed. Yet thousands still rallied to defend their homes, sustaining armies through sheer resolve. The Union followed with its own conscription in March 1863. The Enrollment Act called eligible men into service, but permitted substitution. Any man could pay for another to serve in his place, or by exemption with a $300 commutation fee. For working-class families, this sum was astronomical. Immigrants and laborers, already resentful of fighting a war they feared would flood the North, with free black labor, erupted in anger. The tension reached its breaking point in July with the New York City draft riots. For 4 days, mobs rampaged, attacking draft offices, burning homes, and lynching African Americans in a frenzy of racial violence. Federal troops rushed from the Gettysburg battlefield, restored order at bayonet point. The riots revealed a bitter truth. The Union cause was not universally embraced, and dissent could turn savage. Civil liberties strained under the pressure. Lincoln determined to preserve the Union suspended habeas corpus in critical areas, allowing arrest without trial for suspected disloyalty. Critics accused him of tyranny, but Lincoln insisted necessity justified extraordinary measures. Newspapers were shut, politicians jailed, and protests quelled. For many Northerners, these steps were alarming, but others accepted them as the cost of survival in civil war. In the South, strain was harsher still. The blockade strangled trade, cotton rotted in warehouses, and shortages bit deep. Bread riots broke out in Richmond and other cities led by women desperate to feed families. Confederate currency collapsed, prices soared, and inflation consumed wages. Letters from soldiers at the front often begged kin at home to endure hunger until victory came, but despair spread. The Confederate dream of independence remained, yet the daily grind of scarcity wore down resolve. And still determination persisted. Churches preached sacrifice, communities raised relief funds, and soldiers north and south continued to march and fight despite exhaustion. Both governments tightened their grip, and both populations, however, grudgingly bore the load. War had become total, demanding every resource of state and society. The line between battlefield and home blurred, as railroads, factories, and farms became as vital as cannons and rifles. For Lincoln, 1863 was a crucible. He faced not only Confederate armies, but also dissent in his own backyard. Yet he pressed forward, confident that the Union's greater resources and the righteousness of emancipation would see them through. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis likewise invoked endurance, comparing the Confederacy's struggle to the trials of the American Revolution. Each side hardened its rhetoric, certain that perseverance alone could deliver triumph. Yet the test of determination would not remain abstract. In the West Union, eyes fixed on a fortress city commanding the Mississippi River, Vicksburg. Perched on high bluffs ringed with batteries, Vicksburg barred the Union's control of the great river. Lincoln called it the key, declaring the war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. Ulysses S. Grant, undeterred by earlier criticism, prepared to solve the problem with relentless drive. For him, dissent and draft laws were distant concerns. His focus narrowed to the citadel that defied the Union Navy. The struggle for Vicksburg would test endurance in the field as much as on the home front, and its outcome would shape the war's course. Thus, this chapter closes with both nations weary but determined, battered by dissent, yet unwilling to yield. Riots in New York, breadlines in Richmond, suspensions of liberty and shortages of food, each revealed the war's deep cost beyond the battlefield. Yet amid unrest, the armies still marched, and Grant's eyes turned toward the Mississippi fortress that held the Confederacy's lifeline. Grant fixes on the river fortress, and history leans forward to see if he can break it. By 1863, the Mississippi River was nearly a Union highway. From Cairo, Illinois to New Orleans, gunboats prowled its waters, transports ferried troops, and blue-coated soldiers camped along its bank. Yet one fortress barred complete control: Vicksburg, Mississippi. Sitting high on bluffs that curved with the river, the city was a citadel. Its batteries commanded every bend, its garrison confident no fleet could pass, no army could storm. As long as Vicksburg held the Confederacy's western states, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, remained linked to the east. Control of the river was Lincoln's obsession. Vicksburg, he said, is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. General Ulysses S. Grant accepted the task. His earlier victories at Donelson and Shiloh had proven his tenacity, but now he faced his sternest challenge. Throughout the winter of 1862-63, Grant tried again and again to bypass Vicksburg's defenses. He cut canals through swamps, hoping to reroute the Mississippi and isolate the city. He sent troops to dredge bayous, hacking through cypress and mud, imagining flotillas slipping behind Confederate lines. He ordered levees broken to flood lowlands, hoping to float his forces around the fortress. Each attempt failed, defeated by nature itself. Soldiers slogged waist-deep in muck, sickened with malaria and dysentery, exhausted by futile labor. Newspapers mocked Grant's ditch, and predicted disaster. But Grant did not yield. Where others saw impassable terrain, he searched for audacity. By spring, he devised a plan as bold as it was dangerous. He would march his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, cut loose from supply lines cross below Vicksburg, and strike inland from the south. To succeed, his navy had to run the gauntlet of Vicksburg's guns. Admiral David Dixon Porter, commander of the Mississippi flotilla, prepared the gamble. On a moonless night in April, Porter's ironclads and transports slipped into the current. Confederate gunners opened fire cannons blazing from the bluffs. The river lit with explosions shot and shell whistling across the water. Flames burst as boats were hit, but the fleet pressed on. One by one, battered but afloat, they steamed past the fortress. When dawn broke, Porter's fleet waited below. Vicksburg scarred but ready. The impossible had been done. Grant now ferried his men across to the east bank, cutting himself off from his base. Critics called it madness. Without supply lines, his army depended on living off the land, a dangerous gamble in enemy territory. Yet Grant pressed forward with calm determination. "I can do nothing in the way of supplies," he wrote, "but I will move forward." His soldiers, hardened by months of toil in the swamps, marched with grim resolve. For them, the endless labor in bayous had been misery. The chance to strike at last was relief. Confederate leadership underestimated the threat. General John C. Pemberton, commanding at Vicksburg, scattered his forces uncertain where Grant might strike. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, obsessed with defending territory everywhere, demanded holding Vicksburg at all costs, but offered little guidance. The stage was set for maneuver, and Grant intended to move fast. Instead of battering the fortress head-on, he sought to isolate it, cutting railroads, defeating detachments, and closing in like a tightening fist. The soldiers sensed the shift. Letters home spoke of long marches under blazing sun, of foraging chickens and corn, from farms of skirmishes in tangled woods. Spirits rose as momentum returned. After months of digging and sickness, the army at last moved with purpose. Grant's reputation as relentless grew among his men. He was not eloquent nor flamboyant, but he pressed forward, always forward, never retreating, never pausing. Once a path was found. The Mississippi Valley began to believe he might succeed where others had failed. Vicksburg remained formidable, its guns still commanding the river. Yet Grant had turned the problem from one of brute force to one of cunning. Instead of hammering fruitlessly at the fortress, he sought to envelop it. Porter's bold run past the batteries opened the door. Now Grant's audacity would march through it. What had seemed impregnable began to look vulnerable, not by storm, but by strategy. Thus this chapter closes with the Union Army finally across the river, the fortress behind rather than before them, and Grant moving inland with daring speed. The swamp trials had ended. The campaign had begun. The road to Vicksburg opens, and with it the chance to sever the Confederacy in two. In mid-May, Grant struck at Jackson, Mississippi, the state capital, defeating Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. With Johnston driven back, Grant turned west toward Vicksburg, where General John C. Pemberton scrambled to block him. On May 16, the armies collided at Champion Hill. The rolling ground echoed with cannon fire and musket volleys as Union forces surged forward. Grant's men, battle-hardened, from weeks of marching and skirmishing, smashed through Pemberton's lines. The Confederates retreated in disarray, their path carrying them straight back toward Vicksburg. Grant pressed hard, fighting another sharp action at Big Black River Bridge, forcing Pemberton's troops behind the fortress walls. The trap was sprung. Grant moved swiftly to end it. In late May, he launched direct assaults against Vicksburg's defenses, hoping to overwhelm them before they could strengthen. The results were bloody and futile. Confederate soldiers dug into trenches, and earthworks repelled wave after wave. Union casualties mounted in the thousands, leaving fields littered with the dead. Grant, sobered, recognized that Vicksburg would not fall by storm. He shifted to siege. For 47 days, Union forces ringed the city. Trenches crept forward yard by yard, zigzagging closer to Confederate lines. Artillery pounded relentlessly, shells bursting day and night. The Mississippi thundered with naval guns adding their weight. Inside, Vicksburg civilians huddled in caves, dug into the hillsides seeking shelter from the bombardment. Food grew scarce. Horses, mules, even dogs found their way to dinner tables. Accounts tell of families boiling shoe leather for soup of children faint from hunger. Disease spread as sanitation collapsed. Morale crumbled. Yet Pemberton held on, bound by orders from Davis to defend the fortress at all costs. Grant's army, supplied by the river and supported by Porter's fleet, settled into grim efficiency. Soldiers dug, fought skirmishes, and watched the city with patient determination. Letters home spoke of confidence that the fortress would fall, though many grieved comrades lost in the assaults. Grant himself, often riding the lines, pressed his men to maintain pressure. Slowly, inexorably, the noose tightened. By late June, Confederate soldiers within Vicksburg were gaunt their uniforms, ragged their rations down to handfuls of peas or cornmeal. Desertions whispered through the ranks. Civilians begged Pemberton to surrender, but he hesitated, knowing the shame that would follow. Outside, Grant prepared a final assault mining under Confederate lines, packing explosives to shatter defenses. On the 25th of June, a massive blast ripped a crater in the earth, but still the defenders fought. Yet all knew the end was near. On the 3rd of July, Pemberton finally sought terms. He and Grant met beneath a tree between the lines. Grant, stern but pragmatic, offered generous parole for Confederate soldiers, rather than imprisonment, knowing he lacked resources to hold thousands. Pemberton, desperate, accepted. On the 4th of July, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. Union troops marched in banners, high bands playing. The city that had withstood siege and hunger bowed at last. For the Confederacy, the loss was catastrophic. The Mississippi River now belonged entirely to the Union. The South was split in two. Texas and Arkansas severed from the East. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, declared the Father of Waters, again goes unvexed to the sea. The timing made the triumph even more profound. Just one day earlier at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, Lee's army had reeled from defeat. Two great victories, east and west, transformed the war's course. Hope surged in the north, despair deepened in the south. Independence, once believed near, now looked distant, even impossible. Yet the war was far from over, and the Confederacy, though wounded, fought on. Thus this chapter ends with Vicksburg fallen, its people starved into surrender, and the Mississippi a Union highway. Grant had risen from obscurity to command respect as one of the war's foremost generals. The Confederacy, sundered, faced a future darker than ever before, but even as Union banners flew over Vicksburg, Lee's battered army retreated from Gettysburg, carrying with it the South's last hope for decisive victory. The war had turned, but it was not finished. Surrender on the 4th, one day, that marked a nation's rebirth and a rebellion's slow death. While Grant pressed Pemberton into surrender at Vicksburg far to the east, Robert E. Lee prepared his boldest gamble. The Army of Northern Virginia, bloodied yet triumphant in the 7 days' Second Bull Run. Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville now carried its reputation like a banner. Confederate morale soared, but supplies dwindled. Virginia's farms lay wasted by 2 years of marching and battle. Lee knew his army could not feed itself indefinitely on exhausted soil. To relieve pressure on Virginia, and perhaps strike a decisive blow, he turned north. Across the Potomac lay fertile fields, railroads, and political impact. If he could win a great victory on Union ground, perhaps Northern will would collapse, and Europe would finally recognize the Confederacy. The summer of 1863 would carry the war into Pennsylvania. But before Lee's infantry could march, cavalry thunder shook Virginia. On the 9th of June at Brandy Station along the Rappahannock River, nearly 2,000 horsemen clashed in the largest cavalry battle of the war. Union troopers, once derided as second-rate, compared to the dashing Confederate riders of Jeb Stuart, charged with newfound skill and ferocity. Sabers flashed, carbines cracked, and dust filled the air. Though the battle ended inconclusively, it revealed that Union cavalry had come of age. The days when Stuart could ride circles around Union forces with impunity were ending. Lee's flank screen was still formidable, but his cavalry would face harder tests ahead. From Brandy Station, Lee pushed west through the Shenandoah Valley. The fertile valley, long called the breadbasket of the Confederacy, also offered a protective corridor for his advance. His divisions moved swiftly, brushing aside Union forces at Winchester and clearing the valley. Civilians in Pennsylvania watched anxiously as Confederate columns crossed the Potomac, their long gray lines winding through dusty roads, bands playing Maryland, My Maryland. For many soldiers, the march north was exhilarating, no longer defending their own soil but carrying the war to enemy territory. For civilians along the route, the invasion brought fear. Farms were stripped of food, horses seized, barns emptied. The war that had devastated the South now touched the North directly. Union leaders reeled at the news. With Hooker still commanding the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln demanded vigilance. Lee's army and not Richmond is your true objective, he reminded. Hooker, prickly and uncertain after defeat at Chancellorsville, quarreled with superiors and was soon replaced by George Gordon Meade, a steady Pennsylvanian general. Meade assumed command on the 28th of June, just days before the coming storm, inheriting an army weary but determined to block Lee's path. Lee's plan was ambitious but risky. His army stretched across Pennsylvania, sought supplies in every town and village. Shoes, livestock, grain, all were seized, some paid for in Confederate scrip, often simply taken. The troops sang and joked, but officers knew they were far from home with tenuous lines of communication. Still, Lee pressed on, hoping to force a battle on ground of his choosing. His confidence in his veterans was unshaken. The Confederate high tide gathered strength as it rolled north. Meanwhile, Stuart's cavalry conducted a wide-ranging raid that left Lee blind for crucial days. While Stuart rode east, cutting Union supply lines and capturing wagons, Lee advanced without clear knowledge of enemy movements. This lack of intelligence would prove costly. Meade, moving cautiously but steadily, shadowed Lee's advance. Telegraph lines crackled with urgency, Northern governors called out militia, and towns braced for impact. In Harrisburg, citizens dug trenches. In Philadelphia, panic spread. The war long fought in distant states now loomed at northern doorsteps. For soldiers in both armies, June was a month of exhausting marches. Men trudged in heat, dust-coating uniforms, feet blistered in worn boots. Letters spoke of longing for shade, for water, for rest, but also of anticipation. Everyone knew a great battle was coming, where none could say, but the momentum of history drove both armies toward collision. Thus, June closed with Confederate columns striding through Pennsylvania Union forces, racing to intercept, and a nation holding its breath. Lee sought decision, Meade sought defense, and destiny steered them both toward the rolling hills of southern Pennsylvania. Two armies, nearly 17,000 men combined, groped for each other in the summer heat. Ahead lay 3 days of carnage that would decide far more than ground or glory. Two armies converge on a small Pennsylvania town. The morning of the 1st of July, 1863, dawned clear and hot over the quiet crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Its 2400 residents awoke to find armies converging on their streets and fields, unaware they were about to host the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. By nightfall, thousands would lie dead or wounded, and the struggle for the Union's survival would pivot on ground that only hours earlier had been farmland and orchards. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, advancing north in search of supplies and a decisive engagement, had not intended to fight at Gettysburg. His forces spread widely across Pennsylvania and cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart was absent, leaving him blind to Union movements. General Henry Heth, leading a division of A.P. Hill's corps, marched toward Gettysburg on July 1-inch search of shoes and supplies. Expecting little resistance, he encountered Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford, who had rushed ahead to hold the high ground west of town. Buford's men, dismounted with carbines, fought stubbornly, delaying the Confederate advance until Union reinforcements arrived. By mid-morning, the Union I Corps, under Major General John Reynolds, reached the field. Reynolds, a respected officer, immediately deployed his men into the fight, rallying them with calm authority. As he directed their lines in Herbst Woods, a Confederate bullet struck him down. His sudden death shocked the Union ranks, but did not halt their resolve. Reynolds' sacrifice bought precious time. Union soldiers resisted, fiercely holding ground against superior numbers. The fighting surged through woods, farms, and ridges, musket volleys echoing across the countryside. Confederate reinforcements poured in Ewell's corps, pressing from the north, Hill's men from the west. By afternoon, the Union line buckled under relentless pressure. Brigades fought and fell back in bloody sequence. Gettysburg's streets filled with retreating Union troops as civilians huddled in basements. Confederate soldiers surged through the town, capturing hundreds. Chaos reigned, but discipline held long enough for Union forces to regroup on the high ground south of town. There, on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, Union commanders anchored a defensive position. The ground rose gently, forming a strong line shaped like a fishhook, its curve resting on Culp's Hill to the east, its shank running along Cemetery Ridge to the south. General George G. Meade, newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, recognized the strength of the position. Though battered, the Union Army held the heights a formidable anchor for the coming days. Confederate forces victorious in the day's fight stood poised in Gettysburg, their confidence high. Yet Lee hesitated, cautious of storming fortified ground late in the day. The Union line survived. The first day at Gettysburg cost dearly thousands, dead and wounded on both sides, leaders' fallen farms ruined. For Union soldiers, the loss of ground was offset by the gain of position. They held the heights, and with reinforcements arriving, they prepared to resist. For Confederates, the victory seemed within reach. Morale soared. Prisoners and abandoned cannon proved their success. Yet they faced an enemy not broken but hardened, dug in on ground that favored defense. As night fell, Gettysburg was transformed into a vast encampment of the wounded and dying. Barns, churches, and homes became hospitals. The moans of men filled the air. Civilians like Mary Virginia Wade, known as Jenny, baked bread for soldiers even as battle raged around her. She would be killed the next day, the only civilian to die in the battle. Her fate symbolized how war consumed not just armies, but entire communities. Day one had ended with the Confederates in possession of the town, but not the heights. Lee, encouraged by success, resolved to press the attack the next day. His corps commanders debated, some urging caution, others demanding assault. Meade, steady and pragmatic, reinforced his line through the night, determined to hold. Both sides knew the 2nd of July would be decisive. Thus, this chapter closes, with armies locked in deadly embrace. The Confederates, confident from victory, gazed up at Union positions on Cemetery Hill and Ridge. The Union, battered but resolute, clung to ground that might prove the hinge of the war. Ahead lay ferocious fighting among rocks, ridges, and farms, the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, and a rocky hill called Little Round Top. The stage was set for the crucible of Day 2. Devil's Den and Little Round Top await. The morning of the 2nd of July, 1863, broke with heat and anticipation. Both armies massed around Gettysburg, their lines stretching for miles across hills, ridges, and fields. The Union fishhook formation, anchored on Culp's Hill, bent around Cemetery Hill and extended along Cemetery Ridge toward two rocky outcrops, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. General George Meade, calm but resolute, spent the night strengthening his line. Reinforcements streamed in, swelling his army to nearly 9,000. Across the valley, Robert E. Lee's 7,000 Confederates waited. Lee, confident after Day 1, resolved to smash the Union flanks. His plan: attack the Union left near the Round Tops while pressing the right at Culp's Hill. If both ends collapsed, the Union army would crumble. Delays plagued the Confederate assault. General James Longstreet, tasked with leading the main strike against the Union, left hesitated, reluctant to attack without full preparation. Hours slipped away in countermarches, confusion, and waiting. Not until mid-afternoon did his divisions advance. By then, the Union army had fortified its positions, but not without flaws. At the center of Meade's line, General Daniel Sickles, commanding the III Corps, grew uneasy. Ordered to hold the low ground along Cemetery Ridge, he disliked the position. Impulsive and independent, Sickles advanced his corps nearly a mile forward, occupying the peach orchard and wheat field in a salient that jutted dangerously ahead of the main line. His move exposed both flanks, creating a gap between his corps and the rest of the Union army. When Longstreet's attack finally thundered forward, it struck directly into Sickles's exposed position. The peach orchard became a maelstrom. Confederate artillery shattered trees and fences, while infantry surged through the wheat and orchards. Sickles's men fought desperately, but were overwhelmed. Sickles himself was struck by a cannonball, shattering his leg. He smoked a cigar calmly as he was carried from the field, his corps in tatters. The wheat field, a patch of rolling farmland, changed hands multiple times in ferocious combat. Soldiers described blood pooling among wheat stalks, bodies strewn so thickly they seemed to carpet the ground. Union reinforcements rushed in, only to be driven out, then return again. The field became a charnel house of smoke, fire, and death. South of the peach orchard, Devil's Den, a rocky, boulder-strewn hillside erupted in savage fighting. Confederate sharpshooters took cover among the rocks, sniping at Union positions. The ground was slick with blood bodies wedged between stones. Control shifted back and forth as brigades clashed at close quarters. Nearby, the Union left flank, anchored on Little Round Top, faced its own crisis. At the last moment, General Gouverneur K. Warren recognized that Little Round Top, a rocky hill overlooking the Union line, lay undefended. If Confederates seized it, they could enfilade the entire Union position. Warren rushed reinforcements, the 20th Maine, under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, just as Confederate brigades advanced. For hours, Chamberlain's regiment repelled repeated assaults, their line bending but never breaking. Out of ammunition, facing yet another charge, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet attack. His men swept downhill with fixed steel, stunning their foes and securing the flank. Little Round Top held, and with it the Union left survived. On the Union right, at Culp's Hill, Confederate forces struck, as well pressing into entrenchments in dense woods. The fighting there, though less famous, was equally brutal, with muskets blazing at close range through the night. Both flanks bent but did not break. The Union line endured, though scarred and bloodied. As darkness fell on the 2nd of July, the battlefield lay shattered. The peach orchard and wheat field were littered with dead and dying groans echoing through the night air. Farms that had once yielded harvest now lay ruined, their soil soaked with blood. Union soldiers, exhausted, dug deeper, determined to hold. Confederates, frustrated yet resolute, regrouped for another attempt. Lee remained convinced victory was within grasp. He resolved to strike the Union center the next day with massive force. Thus, Day 2 ended with Union lines battered but intact, Confederates confident yet unfulfilled. Both sides knew the struggle was not finished. The 3rd of July would bring decision. Lee believed, and with it the chance to end the war in triumph. The hills around Gettysburg braced for one more storm. A massive cannonade is coming. The 3rd day at Gettysburg dawned with tension as heavy as the humid July air. For 2 days, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had fought with valor, nearly breaking the Union line at several points. Yet the Union position anchored on the high ground of Cemetery Ridge still held. General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac, battered but resolute, dug in overnight. Both armies knew the next day would decide not only the battle, but perhaps the war's course. Lee, convinced his soldiers could finish what they had begun, made a fateful decision he would strike the Union center with everything he had. That morning, fighting raged again on Culp's Hill, as Confederates renewed assaults against entrenched Union forces. The dense woods crackled with musket fire for hours. Union soldiers well dug in repelled each attack. By mid-morning, Lee turned his attention elsewhere. He believed the Union flanks had been reinforced after the carnage of the 2nd of July, leaving the center weakened. If a concentrated blow could pierce the line along Cemetery Ridge, the Union army might collapse. Despite Longstreet's objections, Lee ordered the assault. It would become infamous as Pickett's charge. Before the infantry advanced, Confederate artillery prepared the way. At 1 p.m., more than 150 guns opened fire across a 2-mile front. Union guns answered, and soon the field shook under the thunder of the largest cannonade yet seen on the continent. Civilians miles away heard the rolling detonations. Smoke blanketed the ridges, shells shrieked overhead, earth trembled beneath the barrage. Union soldiers hugged the ground, their ears ringing, their nerves stretched. Then, as the cannonade slackened, silence fell, a silence broken by the tramp of feet. Out of the smoke stepped 12500, Confederate soldiers forming ranks nearly a mile wide. At the center marched Major General George Pickett's fresh division, alongside brigades led by Pettigrew and Trimble. Officers waved swords, battle flags fluttered. Across the open fields they advanced, steady as if on parade. Union soldiers watched in awe and dread as the grey lines marched closer, sunlight glinting off bayonets. Then the Union cannon roared. Shells tore gaps in the ranks, men falling by the dozens, yet the lines closed and pressed forward. As they neared the Union position, musket fire erupted from behind stone walls and fences. Whole companies crumpled under the volleys. Still, the Confederates surged on, shouting the rebel yell. At a low stone wall near the copse of trees, Brigadier General Lewis Armistead led his men into the Union line, briefly breaching it. He fell mortally wounded with his hand on a Union cannon. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then, Union reinforcements surged, sealing the breach. The Confederate attack dissolved into chaos. Survivors fled back across the fields they had so bravely crossed, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. Pickett's division was shattered. Of his men, more than half did not return. Meanwhile, to the east, J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry attempted to flank the Union line, hoping to strike its rear. Union cavalry under George Armstrong Custer charged to meet them. Sabers flashed, horses collided, carbines cracked. After brutal fighting, Stuart's attempt failed. The Union rear held firm. By late afternoon, the Battle of Gettysburg was decided. Lee's army, exhausted and bloodied, could do no more. That night and the next day, he began withdrawing south, his wagons filled with wounded, his army limping back toward Virginia. He expected pursuit, but Meade cautious followed slowly. The fields of Gettysburg were left behind, littered with more than 5,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing. Families would never see loved ones again. Townspeople faced years of tending graves. Lee met his officers and took full responsibility. "It is all my fault," he said quietly. His men, though defeated, still revered him, but the aura of invincibility that had cloaked the Army of Northern Virginia was gone. For the Union, the victory was immense, though costly. The Army of the Potomac had held its ground, proving that Lee could be beaten in open battle on Northern soil. The 4th of July, 1863, brought news of another triumph: Vicksburg's surrender on the Mississippi. 2 victories east and west in the same week. Twin turning points had arrived. The Confederacy, once confident of foreign recognition and ultimate triumph, now reeled. Yet the war was far from over. Lee's army lived to fight again, and the struggle ahead would still demand years of sacrifice. Thus this chapter ends with the fields of Gettysburg silent, strewn with the wreckage of war. Union soldiers stood weary but proud. Confederates trudged south, their hopes dimmed but not extinguished. The tide had turned, but the cost was staggering. Twin turning points, what next? The summer of 1863 brought jubilation in the North. Gettysburg held, Vicksburg surrendered, and the Mississippi flowed unvexed to the sea. But triumph quickly gave way to strain. Beneath the victories smoldered unrest, violence, and despair. The war's cost pressed hardest on ordinary people, and fires of dissent blazed on both sides of the divided nation. At the very moment when the Union seemed ascendant, its home front revealed fractures that threatened to undo progress bought in blood. In July, as Union soldiers still buried comrades at Gettysburg, New York City, erupted in fury. The first federal draft lottery had been drawn, and resentment among the city's working class, especially Irish immigrants, exploded. Many feared emancipation would flood the North, with freed black laborers competing for scarce jobs. The $300 commutation fee, allowing wealthier men to avoid service, enraged the poor. On the 13th of July, mobs stormed the streets, torching draft offices, attacking police, and targeting African-American residents with horrifying violence. Black men were lynched, orphanages burned, families hunted. For 4 days, chaos reigned, until Union troops rushed from Gettysburg, restored order with bayonets and cannon. More than 100 people were killed, thousands injured. The draft riots laid bare bitter divides of class and race, proving that victory in battle could not erase turmoil at home. In the Midwest, guerrilla violence scarred the border. Kansas, already soaked in blood before the war, endured one of its darkest days in August 1863, when Confederate guerrilla William Quantrill and his raiders descended on Lawrence. They slaughtered more than 150 men and boys, torching the town in a rampage of fire and vengeance. Women and children screamed as flames consumed homes, while raiders mocked the helpless. The Lawrence Massacre became a rallying cry for Unionists in the West, deepening hatred and fueling retaliation. It symbolized the brutal, irregular warfare that racked Missouri and Kansas, where neighbors murdered neighbors and entire communities lived under fear. On the strategic front, the glow of Gettysburg and Vicksburg dimmed as the Union faltered at Chickamauga in September. There, in northern Georgia, Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg inflicted a costly defeat on Union General William Rosecrans. The Union Army retreated into Chattanooga, Tennessee, besieged and near starvation. For a moment, Confederate hopes revived, but Union leadership responded swiftly. Reinforcements under Joseph Hooker, George Thomas, and especially Ulysses S. Grant rushed in. Grant took overall command of the Western Theater, reorganizing demoralized forces. In November, at the battles for Chattanooga Union, troops stormed Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain in daring assaults. Soldiers climbed steep slopes under fire, driving Confederates into retreat. The siege lifted, and the gateway to the Deep South lay open. Once again, Confederate dreams of reversing the tide collapsed. Amid these upheavals, Lincoln sought to give meaning to sacrifice. In November 1863, he traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a new cemetery for the Union dead. After a long oration by another speaker, Lincoln rose and spoke fewer than 300 words. His Gettysburg address, brief and solemn, reframed the war's purpose. He invoked the nation's founding, declaring that the struggle was not only for union, but for a new birth of freedom. The dead had consecrated the ground with their blood, he said. The living must ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Listeners were struck by the simplicity, the moral clarity. Newspapers reprinted the words, and in time, they became immortal. Lincoln had given the war its creed. For Northerners weary of casualty lists and soaring taxes for Southerners enduring hunger and loss, the autumn of 1863 revealed the war's dual reality, triumph and tragedy intertwined. Victory in the field did not silence dissent. Riots, massacres, and political rancor made clear that the Union's survival depended not only on generals, but on the endurance of its people. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis faced a fractious Congress and public anger over shortages, but he insisted the Confederacy would never yield. The conflict seemed endless, demanding more from both nations than they ever imagined. Thus, this chapter closes, with the Union recovering from crisis, its armies victorious at Chattanooga, its cause reframed at Gettysburg, and its greatest general rising to prominence. The road to final victory required new strategy and relentless leadership. That leadership was now clear. Grant, tested in the West, would soon be called East. Grant is promoted and unleashed. By early 1864, the war had raged nearly 3 years. Battles had swept from the Mississippi swamps to Pennsylvania hills, from Tennessee ridges to Virginia fields. Yet, still no final decision had been reached. Armies clashed, cities burned, thousands fell, but the Confederacy endured. Lincoln knew the Union needed not just victories, but a strategy to crush resistance once and for all. To carry it out, he elevated Ulysses S. Grant, the general who had taken Donelson, triumphed at Vicksburg and redeemed Chattanooga. In March 1864, Grant was appointed general-in-chief of all Union armies. He chose not to remain in Washington, but to accompany the Army of the Potomac in the field, determined to face Robert E. Lee directly. The coming campaign would be unlike anything America had yet seen, a grinding war of exhaustion. Grant's plan was broad, coordinated, relentless. In Virginia, he and Meade would hammer Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, keeping it pinned so it could not reinforce elsewhere. Meanwhile, Sherman would march into Georgia, striking at Atlanta, the Confederacy's industrial and rail hub. Other Union armies would press in the Shenandoah Valley and along the Gulf. The goal was no longer territorial gain alone, but total destruction of Confederate capacity to fight. "I propose to fight it out on this line, if it takes all summer," Grant declared. He meant it. In May 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River with more than 1,000,000 men. Lee, with scarcely 6,000, moved to intercept in the wilderness a dense thicket of scrub and second-growth forest where maneuver was impossible. On May 5, the armies collided. Fire spread through dry underbrush, smoke choked, soldiers' visibility shrank to yards. Men fought hand to hand in tangled woods, their cries drowned by musket volleys. The wilderness was chaos, but unlike his predecessors, Grant did not retreat after the inconclusive clash. Instead, he turned southeast, continuing toward Richmond. Union soldiers cheered when they realized they were marching forward, not back. Grant had locked onto Lee and would not let go. 2 days later came Spotsylvania. There, Grant hurled repeated assaults against entrenched Confederate lines. The most ferocious came on May 12 at the Bloody Angle, where soldiers fought for nearly 20 hours in driving rain muskets, firing point-blank bayonets, and clubbed rifles swinging in desperate struggle. The earthworks collapsed into mud bodies trampled into the mire. Casualties soared, yet Grant pressed on. "I propose to fight it out," he repeated, and his men believed him. For the first time, Lee faced an opponent who matched his endurance with equal determination. Onward the campaign ground, North Anna, Cold Harbor, each a slaughterhouse. At Cold Harbor in early June, Union assaults against fortified Confederate lines cost thousands in minutes. Survivors pinned notes to their jackets before attacking, knowing they might not live to be identified. Critics raged at the losses, but Grant refused to abandon pressure. "I regret this assault more than any one I have ever ordered," he admitted of Cold Harbor. Yet he remained fixed on the strategy: destroy Lee's army by constant battle, deny him rest, grind him down. The cost was staggering. By summer, Grant's overland campaign inflicted and suffered casualties on a scale never seen before in America, tens of thousands in a single month. Union soldiers grumbled, newspapers cried butcher, but Grant's resolve never wavered. Unlike earlier generals, he did not retreat after bloody repulses. He maneuvered again and again, sliding left always toward Richmond, always forcing Lee to respond. Lee, master of defense, fought brilliantly but bled steadily. The Confederacy could not replace losses. The Union could. It was arithmetic war, pitiless but decisive. At last, Grant reached the outskirts of Petersburg, south of Richmond, in June 1864. The city was the rail hub feeding Richmond and Lee's army. If Petersburg fell, the capital would be strangled. But Petersburg's defenses held trenches stretching for miles, manned by veterans determined to resist. What began as an attempt to storm the city hardened into siege. Soldiers on both sides dug elaborate earthworks, foreshadowing the trench warfare of a later century. Skirmishes, raids, and mines erupted along the lines, but Petersburg did not fall quickly. It became a test of endurance supplies and national will. For Union soldiers, the campaign was grim proof that the war had changed. Gone were dreams of quick glory. In their place came endless marches, bloody assaults, and nights in muddy trenches. Letters home told of exhaustion of comrades, loss of faith tested, for Confederates' hope dimmed. They had checked Grant again and again, yet each time he advanced further. Lee, weary and ill, fought brilliantly still, but his army shrank with every battle. Petersburg became both shield and prison. Thus this chapter closes, with armies locked in siege outside Richmond, the Union, bleeding but advancing, the Confederacy battered but unbroken. Grant had forged a new kind of war, unyielding, relentless fought until one side collapsed. Ahead lay months of trench fighting, new campaigns in Georgia, and an election in the North that would decide the Union's future. Petersburg holds for now, and the clock keeps ticking. By mid-1864, the war had entered a new and brutal phase. The Union under Grant's command no longer sought single decisive battles alone. Instead, it pursued coordinated campaigns designed to strangle the Confederacy's resources, crush its armies, and break the will of its people. This was war expanded total war, where fields, factories, and railroads became as much targets as fortresses and armies. The year's campaigns in the Shenandoah Valley and Georgia embodied this grim transformation. The Shenandoah Valley, long called the breadbasket of the Confederacy, fed Lee's army and offered a natural invasion route into the north. Time and again, Confederate forces had used the valley to threaten Washington. Grant resolved to end that threat. He turned to General Philip Sheridan, a fiery Irish-born cavalryman with a reputation for aggressiveness. In summer 1864, Sheridan unleashed destruction. At Winchester and Cedar Creek, his troops smashed Confederate forces under Jubal, early driving them from the valley. More devastating still, Sheridan's men laid waste to the land, burning barns, mills, and crops, slaughtering livestock, ensuring the valley could no longer sustain Confederate armies. Civilians watched in despair as smoke darkened the sky. Sheridan's campaign became infamous, remembered in the South as the Burning. For the Union, it was ruthless necessity. For Confederates, it was terror. Farther south, General William Tecumseh Sherman led the Union's other great campaign. Marching from Chattanooga in May 1864, he commanded nearly 1,000,000 men against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's smaller force. The campaign toward Atlanta became a chess match of flanking maneuvers. Johnston, cautious, fell back, repeatedly trading space for time, retreating from mountain ridges and river lines, rather than risk destruction. Sherman advanced relentlessly, using railroads to sustain his army and tearing up Confederate tracks behind him. By July, the armies neared Atlanta, the industrial heart of the Deep South. President Jefferson Davis, frustrated with Johnston's retreats, replaced him with the fiery General John Bell Hood. Hood launched furious counterattacks, hoping to smash Sherman's columns. The battles around Atlanta, Peachtree Creek, Ezra Church, and others were savage, but Hood's assaults bled his army white. Sherman tightened his grip. On the 2nd of September, Union forces entered Atlanta. The city, vital rail hub and symbol of Confederate resistance, fell in flames as retreating Confederates destroyed supplies. Northern newspapers blared the victory church bells rang, and hope surged. For the Confederacy, Atlanta's fall was a mortal blow, shattering morale and severing a key artery of war. These campaigns revealed the new face of Union strategy. Railroads were twisted into Sherman's neckties, ties heated and bent around trees. Bridges were torched, telegraphs cut, factories demolished. The Union no longer fought merely to defeat armies. It fought to dismantle the South's ability to fight at all. Civilians suffered deeply, bearing losses that blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant. For soldiers, too, the campaigns were grueling. Endless marches, constant skirmishes, hunger and heat wore men down. Yet victories in the Valley and Georgia proved the strategy effective. The political stakes in the North rose with every battle. 1864 was an election year, and Lincoln faced mounting criticism. Casualty lists from Grant's overland campaign had shocked the public, and his Democratic opponent, George B. McClellan, the very General Lincoln, had once removed campaigned on peace negotiations. Many feared the war would drag on, indefinitely draining blood and treasure without resolution. By summer, Lincoln himself doubted re-election. He drafted a memorandum pledging cooperation with his successor, if defeated, determined at least to preserve the Union effort through transition. But the victories of autumn changed everything. Sheridan's devastation of the Shenandoah and Sherman's capture of Atlanta reinvigorated Northern confidence. Newspapers hailed Lincoln's leadership, and voters saw hope for final triumph. Union soldiers allowed to vote from the field overwhelmingly backed their commander-in-chief. Lincoln's re-election in November was secured a mandate to see the war through to unconditional victory. For the Confederacy, 1864 was disaster. The Shenandoah lay in ruins. Atlanta was gone. Hood's army battered, and Lee remained trapped before Petersburg. Yet still Southerners fought, clinging to hope that Northern will might yet falter. Letters from soldiers spoke of homes destroyed, families hungry, spirits worn but pride unbroken. The Confederacy endured, but its foundations crumbled. Thus, this chapter closes with Union triumphs, but also with uncertainty. Sheridan's burning and Sherman's capture of Atlanta marked total war's rise, reshaping the conflict and the South itself. Yet the Union still bled, and Lincoln's political survival hung in the balance. Victory at the ballot box was as vital as victory in the field. The question now loomed with casualties mounting and years of war endured. Could Lincoln persuade a weary republic to finish the fight? Can Lincoln survive November? By November 1864, the war had consumed nearly 4 years, and the nation stood at a crossroads. Lincoln faced re-election amid immense pressure. Casualties mounted in the trenches before Petersburg, and many Northerners hungered for peace. Democrats rallying behind former Union General George B. McClellan promised negotiation with the Confederacy. If Lincoln lost, the war might end with the Union divided and slavery intact. For months, even Lincoln feared defeat. He wrote a memorandum pledging to work with his successor to save what Union he could. Yet fate and battlefield victories reshaped the political landscape. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September and Sheridan's devastation of the Shenandoah Valley gave the North hope of final triumph. In November, soldiers in the field voted overwhelmingly for their commander-in-chief, and Lincoln secured re-election by a wide margin. The verdict was clear: the Union would fight on until victory. For Confederates, the result was crushing. Many had clung to hopes that Northern resolve would collapse, that peace Democrats might hand them recognition of independence. Lincoln's victory shattered those dreams. Jefferson Davis insisted the South would never surrender, but desertions grew, resources dwindled, and faith waned. In letters, Confederate soldiers wrote of hunger, ragged clothing, and despair. Families on the home front struggled with shortages so severe that women rioted for bread in Richmond and other cities. The Confederate economy, already battered by blockade and inflation, spiraled into ruin. Prison camps revealed the war's darkest costs. At Andersonville in Georgia, Union prisoners crowded into squalid stockades, exposed to sun and rain, drinking from fouled streams. Nearly 130,000 died of disease, starvation, and exposure. In the North, Confederate captives suffered as well, though generally with less horror. Both sides struggled to feed and clothe men as resources thinned. Prisoner exchanges faltered after the Emancipation Proclamation, as the Confederacy refused to treat black Union soldiers as legitimate combatants. The suffering of captives mirrored the collapse of order across the South. On the battlefield, the Confederacy fought doggedly but bled steadily. Hood's reckless campaigns after Atlanta shattered his army in Tennessee, leaving the South without its western shield. Lee clung to Petersburg and Richmond. His army entrenched his men, gaunt his supplies nearly gone. Yet his defense, masterful and desperate, prolonged the war. Petersburg became a siege of months' trenches, stretching for miles, soldiers enduring mud, lice, and hunger. Sniper fire, mortar shells, and raids turned daily life into torment. Civilians in Richmond rationed food, endured inflation, and prayed for relief that never came. Meanwhile, Sherman prepared his boldest stroke. Having taken Atlanta, he cut loose from supply lines and marched toward the sea. His army of 60,000 moved through Georgia, destroying railroads, seizing crops, and burning resources that sustained the Confederacy. It was war carried into the South's very heart, designed to break not only armies, but the will of a people. Sherman declared his aim was to make Georgia howl. His march would carve a path of destruction that Confederate forces could not stop, opening the way for Union triumph in the Deep South. For Union soldiers, the re-election of Lincoln renewed purpose. Letters home expressed pride that their sacrifices had not been in vain. For many, voting for Lincoln in the field was an act of faith in victory. They knew the war would not end quickly, but they believed it would end rightly, with the Union restored and slavery destroyed. For Confederates, Lincoln's triumph meant despair. No rescue from politics or foreign powers would come. Only endurance, dwindling and painful, remained. Thus, the final coil of the Confederacy tightened. Its armies shrank, its economy collapsed, its people starved, yet it fought on. Lincoln, strengthened by re-election, now pushed for the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery everywhere, aiming to ensure that the war's blood would yield lasting change. The conflict neared its end, but the cost would grow still higher. Ahead lay Sherman's march through Georgia, and the vice closing at Petersburg. The Confederacy still stood, but its pillars crumbled. A march to the sea and a vice at Petersburg now loomed. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy staggered on its last legs. Sherman's march to the sea had gutted Georgia, his columns cutting swaths of ruin through towns, farms, and railroads before sweeping north through the Carolinas. Grant's siege lines at Petersburg stretched tighter, strangling Richmond. Desertion thinned Confederate ranks, hunger gnawed at soldiers and civilians alike, and supplies dwindled to nothing. Yet Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia still clung to its trenches, a shadow of the force that had once thundered across battlefields. Honor, pride, and desperation held them together. The end was near, and all knew it. March brought further blows. Sherman's forces, linked with those of General Schofield in North Carolina, sealing off the Deep South. Johnston's Confederate army, outnumbered and demoralized, shadowed him without hope of reversing fortune. In Virginia, Lee's lines buckled under relentless Union assaults. At Fort Stedman in late March, Lee launched a desperate counterattack, briefly breaking through, but swiftly repelled. Grant tightened his grip, preparing to deliver the final stroke. Lincoln, visiting the front at City Point, walked the camps, speaking with soldiers sensing the war's close. "It is nearly over," he told aides, though he cautioned that peace would bring its own trials. On the 2nd of April, Union troops stormed Confederate positions at Petersburg. The defenses collapsed after 10 months of siege. That night, Jefferson Davis fled Richmond as fires consumed the city. Union forces entered the Confederate capital the next morning. Civilians wept, some in despair, others in relief. Black residents, many newly freed, thronged the streets, cheering the sight of Union troops. Lincoln himself walked through Richmond days later, greeted by jubilant freedmen who knelt at his feet. "Do not kneel to me," he said gently. "You must kneel only to God and thank Him for your freedom." The moment symbolized the war's transformation. Union restored, slavery destroyed, but the struggle for justice still beginning. Lee, retreating west with dwindling supplies, hoped to link with Johnston in North Carolina. Grant pursued relentlessly, cutting railroads, blocking escape routes. Union cavalry under Sheridan struck hard at supply trains, while infantry pressed from behind. Confederate soldiers, gaunt and ragged, marched barefoot, eating parched corn, many throwing down arms to slip away home. Still, Lee refused surrender, determined to fight while any chance remained. His men's loyalty endured even as their strength failed. At Appomattox Courthouse, on the 9th of April 1865, the chase ended. Surrounded, exhausted, Lee met Grant in the home of Wilmer McLean, whose previous residence had hosted the first battle at Bull Run Fate, bringing the war full circle. The two generals, so different in bearing, embodied the moment. Lee, dignified in dress uniform, spoke with calm sorrow. Grant, mud-stained and plain, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would surrender arms, but be paroled, allowed to return home with their horses for spring planting. There would be no trials for treason, no vengeance, only peace. Lee accepted, his voice heavy with grief. Outside, soldiers stacked muskets, furled flags, and wept openly. Some Union men saluted their defeated foes. The war between the armies was over. The nation exhaled, yet the peace was fragile. On the 14th of April, only days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. There, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, fired a pistol shot that struck the president in the head. Lincoln died the next morning. Bells tolled, crowds wept, the Union rejoiced in victory, yet plunged into mourning. The man who had steered the Republic through its greatest trial did not live to see the work of rebuilding. His death darkened the triumph, reminding all that wounds of war did not close easily. For the Confederacy, the collapse was complete. Johnston surrendered to Sherman weeks later, and other forces laid down arms through the spring. The rebellion had cost more than 6,000,000 lives, devastated entire regions, and scarred the nation's soul. Freedom had been proclaimed, the Union restored, but peace promised further battles, political, social, and racial, that would test America anew. Thus, this chapter ends with surrender, at Appomattox soldiers stacking arms, and a nation mourning its fallen leader. The guns fell silent, but the questions left behind were immense. How to reunite bitter enemies, how to give true meaning to emancipation, how to heal a land drenched in blood. Victory closed one chapter, but the harder one now began. Peace is hard, reunion harder. The role of the historical script writing assistant is to ensure plaintext output exactly 5000 characters, excluding spaces, no titles, no sound cues, no YouTube policy violation optimized for 11 Labs Voice US, tone maintained. The guns fell silent in 1865, but the war's echoes reverberated for generations. The Union was preserved, the Confederacy extinguished, and 4 million enslaved men, women, and children emerged from bondage. Yet emancipation, though monumental, was only the beginning. Freedom came unevenly fragile, contested at every turn. The legacy of the Civil War was not just victory on battlefields, but a struggle to define the meaning of liberty, equality, and nationhood in a republic scarred by loss. The human cost was staggering. More than 6,000,000 soldiers died, leaving countless widows, orphans, and grieving families. Cemeteries filled with rows of white headstones, silent testimony to sacrifice. In towns north and south, maimed veterans returned home to farms and shops, carrying scars visible and unseen. Some built lives anew, others sank into poverty and pain. Women who had kept households and farms through war shouldered burdens still heavier in its aftermath. For freed people, the promise of liberty brought joy, reunion, and hope, but also peril. Families torn apart by slavery searched desperately for lost kin, tracing rumors across states, following whispers of names. Churches, schools, and communities bloomed symbols of resilience and self-determination. Yet freedom without protection left many vulnerable to violence, discrimination, and exploitation. Reconstruction began amid this fragile dawn. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery everywhere, enshrining emancipation in law. But deeper questions loomed. Would freedmen gain land, education, political rights? Would the South accept reunion on new terms? Radical Republicans pressed for sweeping change. Citizenship, suffrage, civil equality, while many white Southerners resisted, fiercely clinging to the old order. Federal troops occupied the South, enforcing new policies, while black men cast ballots for the first time and even held office. Yet, resistance soon grew violent. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan waged terror campaigns, reminding all that the struggle for freedom did not end with Appomattox. The memory of the war itself became contested ground. In the North, monuments and speeches framed the conflict as a holy cause, a struggle to preserve the Union and end slavery. In the South, a lost cause mythology emerged, painting Confederates as noble defenders of states' rights, minimizing slavery's role. These competing memories shaped how generations understood the war, obscuring or clarifying its meaning, depending on who told the story. Even as the Union triumphed, the battle over interpretation had only begun. For Lincoln, martyred at war's end, memory sanctified his leadership. His words at Gettysburg and his final call for malice toward none, charity for all, became guiding lights, though the reality of Reconstruction often fell short. For Freedman, his death was mourned as the loss of a protector. For many Northerners, it symbolized both the cost of victory and the fragility of progress. The unfinished work of reunion and equality lay heavy on his successors. The war's technological and political legacies endured as well. Railroads, telegraphs, ironclads, and trench warfare foreshadowed conflicts of the future. Federal authority expanded permanently, redefining the balance between states and nation. The idea of America as a perpetual union indivisible became unquestioned. And yet, the contradictions of liberty remained, pushing forward new struggles, civil rights, equality, justice, that stretched far beyond the 19th century. In homes and classrooms today, the Civil War remains central to America's story. Its battles, its leaders, its sacrifices are remembered not only for their past, but for their lessons. It was a war fought over the deepest human stakes: freedom and bondage, union and disunion, democracy and its limits. Those questions, though answered in blood, still echo. Each generation re-examines them, finding in the war a mirror of its own dilemmas. Thus, the story ends not in closure, but in challenge. The Civil War preserved the Union and ended slavery, but peace was fragile. Justice, incomplete, memory divided. The Republic survived, yet its work remained unfinished. Today, as in 1865, the question persists: how will a nation live up to its founding promise? What choices would we make now, with stakes just as human? The role of the historical script writing assistant is to ensure plain text output exactly 5000 characters, excluding spaces, no titles, no sound cues, no YouTube policy violation, optimized for 11 Labs Voice US, tone maintained.